What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and normally I'm analyzing apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Tonight, Dr. Carrier is joining me to look at the most recent Dr. Kipp Davis interview. How you doing there, Dr. Carrier?
Doing all right. Tonight is Elijah Craig, is the nerve calmer.
Yeah, I've actually got, this is going to be one of the first times I can have like an actual cup of whiskey. And so I've got, it's like a Chattanooga, it's a Chattanooga whiskey thing. I don't know. I can't remember the exact brand name, but anyways, so it's Chattanooga whiskey, and I'm just going to be sipping on this just a little bit.
Yeah, fantastic.
Small sips. Yeah. All right. So now I don't know if anybody doesn't know you, Dr. Carrier, but do you want to let everybody know like who you are, what you do, and where they can find you and stuff?
Sure. In the off chance no one in here knows who I am. So all things me, you can find at richardcarrier.info. That's just richardcarrier.info. That has my blog. It has the feeds for my Facebook, my Twitter. If you want to take my online courses, they're correspondence courses, they're available there. All my books are there. So everything you want to know about me is there. I'm a PhD in ancient history from Columbia University. I'm an independent scholar currently, and probably for life, because I really like the lifestyle. And I do, I have two tracks, actually. I do ancient history and I do modern contemporary philosophy. Today we're on a history subject, and I've done a few things in history. So like, obviously the historicity of Jesus is a big thing, because a lot of patrons are very interested in that. And so, so that's how I get involved, how I got involved in it. And now I'm just stuck. So, but I love other subjects. So like ancient science and technology, for example, and various other things, but you can find out all about that on my website if you go digging around. But yeah, so what happened, for people who don't know, is I'm the first person to publish a peer-reviewed study on the historicity of Jesus in almost 100 years, specifically on that subject and examining it in detail. No one had done that really before, and since the early 20th century. And I did not come to the conclusion everyone wanted. So that has led to a lot of counter apologetics and apologetics and so on since, even from the atheist side of things. So we have atheists who are apologists for the historicity of Jesus. And anyway, so that's how I got involved in this topic. And I come at it from someone with a classics and history background, solidly in the literature of the period.
Awesome. Yeah, and I have to say, I definitely recommend any course that you offer. I from any platform. I've taken a couple of them, and I got a lot out of it. I felt like I was a lot more knowledgeable after having gone through them, and it was great. It was a great experience in general. So
yeah, thanks. I've designed them. Yeah, for that. They are like self-directed study, but it's also like you get a month of free Q&A. Basically, just ask me questions on the forum, as many questions as you have on the subjects, and it just allows you to steer yourself in towards understanding the concepts and organizing the concepts of each subject. So I do both philosophy subjects and ancient history subjects. Obviously, this is one of the subjects, the historicity of Jesus, just so that you can be like well informed and you've got a good basis for continuing your own research on it. So it just gives you a solid starting point, and hones skills you might already have, but like perfects them and so on. So that's the goal of those courses. So if people are interested in that, check those out.
Definitely. I do have Dr. Carrier linked down below, along with other resources that will be coming up in the course of the review tonight of Dr. Kipp Davis and Dapper Dino. From what I can tell, just talking a whole bunch of shit about mythicism and personally criticizing you. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say about it. Now, I do have to say, I don't know if this will make either Dapper or Kipp feel better, but I've had to watch the entire stream twice and then go through and cut down what I could to make it manageable clips for us to respond to.
But
So
to inform the audience, I have not seen it at all. So I just wanted to do a reaction thing. So I will be, these clips that John's going to show, I will be seeing them for the first time. I myself don't really follow this anymore because I think like Kipp Davis, if people go to my blog and read the articles I wrote about how Kipp Davis is handling this subject, he's just doing a poor job. He's not doing the research. He's not really checking this stuff. He's not really reading my work. So there isn't really any reason for me personally to engage with anything that he's saying on this. But nonetheless, it constitutes disinformation, and some of my patrons are interested to hear my remarks on this. So this has been funded. So my patrons actually paid me to sit here and get my reactions to, I guess, some of the craziest or most flawed things that they said. I don't know. I guess we'll find out when I see it. But ordinarily I wouldn't be here bothering. But here, so hence the libations.
Yes. Before we get into the stream tonight, I just want everybody to know, I don't know how other YouTubers are at this time of year, but shit's pretty slim for me. So if we could get more members and more super chats and everything. I'm just joking. Anyways, I have to give them context. Okay.
Yeah.
Now that I did it, I got to give context. So this stream was apparently an emergency stream because they couldn't host the live stream over on Dapper Dinosaur's channel because he got a community guideline strike because he was dealing with some he was refuting some like I don't know if it was anti-vax or it was just some like deep conspiracy theory type stuff concerning like medical health and everything like that. So I was kind of making a light joke of it because, like, I don't know, I've experienced this before. Like, I've gotten community guideline strikes and my channel's been down. I have multiple funding streams where I don't have to do like a GoFundMe or something like that in order to get some money. But I was just making light of that. But in any case,
I don't know the whole story, but as I understand it, though, it was a bullshit poll, right? Like he didn't really violate any. It was just standard troll bullshit interfering with his income stream, which that kind of shit pisses me off. So I sympathize with him on that.
Oh yeah, I mean I totally get it too. And he was only down for a couple days, I believe. It came back up right afterwards. So just trying to have a little fun before getting into the video because right. I do have a lot of things to say on this topic. But we're going to go ahead and cut right over here. So just to preface with this first bit, there's these first two sections that we don't really have to talk too much on, but I did want to highlight these things. So this first section is basically just questioning your credentials in order to make comments on this topic on the historicity of Jesus and stuff.
It's so funny because the historicists will always say that we shouldn't be doing this and complaining about it, and then here they go and they just do it. It's just funny.
But I do have this juxtaposed, and I'm gonna have some interesting images and quotes and everything to bring up and talk through this, but I've juxtaposed it to them actually promoting people that are criticizing Carrier's position, but have no credentials in order to do so. And so it's really weird, like criticizing Carrier for not having credentials, but then these people that obviously do not have credentials, they are like, oh, this is a really good thing and you should listen to it. Right. And I've got examples as to why I disagree that those are good, like responses and reviews. But
all right.
Let's go ahead and head right on.
Well, we can, again, we will preface this that I do have a PhD, and in fact I have the whole slate of master's degrees, Master of Philosophy, and PhD in ancient history, specifically on religious and intellectual history of the early Roman Empire, from Columbia University. So, trained in the languages of Greek and Latin. I read scholarship in French and German. I've done multiple. I have an impressive CV with lots of publications that I've gotten through peer review. So I'm a real scholar with actual credentials. There's not a degree mill. I'm not a bachelor's degree or a high school grad or anything like that. So,
right. So now, would this include specifically like early Christianity and stuff of that nature?
yeah, history of religion. So, early Roman Empire, religions in the early Roman Empire is one of my 4 major subjects for my PhD. Obviously, I've written on Christianity in various aspects as well, but but yes, right, yeah, and frankly, like when we're doing a question like the existence of a person, we're talking about historical methodology, we're talking comparative history. So you really have to understand, how do we know anyone existed? How do you know Hannibal existed? How do you know Spartacus existed? How do you read ancient literature? Like what you have to know classics, right? You have to know Greek. You have to know Greek rhetoric. You have to know Greek educational system, how that affects literature. You got to know all of this stuff, which is exactly what we train in when we do ancient history at a major university like Columbia. So these are all the skill sets that are actually more important for answering a question like whether a particular person existed or not, because you have to understand, how do you make a case like that for anybody in the ancient world? And that's the only way that you can then start to compare for what we have for Jesus, and does it hold up and under the same standards?
Right. Okay, so we're just gonna let Kipp talk. It's Kipp and Dapper. They're talking about credentials, and criticizing your credentials in particular, but then offering, some people that don't have credentials as being like great in this area. So
Right, right.
let's see what they got.
The reason I did this whole thing is because I've been asked more than once on my channel to cover mythicism. And on the one hand, I understand why, right? Like, it's a topic that comes up in a lot of sort of pseudoscience debunking skeptic type channels, which my channel fits into not as well as it could, but in many ways. But also, it's because I have a history degree, and I think that people think that, well, if you have a history degree, you must just be an expert in all the history. But in fact, like, my minor was in Renaissance and medieval studies, which, as you might not know, or you might or might not know, like, that doesn't have a whole lot to do with like first centuries, BCE and CE, like Palestine and areas around there, or Judea, depending on what time we're talking about here. I wanted to.
Okay, so I know that Dapper talks a little fast, but Kipp makes up for it when he talks, because he's a little bit slower.
I was wondering if you had the channel running fast, but okay.
But Dapper's talking a little fast. So Dapper Dinosaur has, I guess, an undergraduate in medieval history, is what he was saying, and
said medieval Renaissance history, right? Yeah,
right, yeah.
I wanted to talk to Dr. Kipp Davis because not only is he an expert in these areas, right, like early Jewish texts, he knows the languages involved, and he is also plugged in with the the general academic consensus of biblical studies, all this stuff. But also, he's a fun guy to talk to. So let's take a look at what are the arguments that are used by mythicists, including, I think the primary driver of mythicism is unarguably Richard Carrier, right? Like, I don't think he's the only person who's even, as far as I can tell, like close to credentialed, who makes it his mission to push for Jesus mythicism.
I had a little bit of issue there when he said close to credentialed, as if like not credentialed, but he's nearly there. And it just
also they're forgetting, as they keep forgetting, Raphael Lataster, who has a PhD in religious studies, and also knows the material and has a relevant degree. But but yeah, so that is kind of silly. Close to credentialed.
Yeah. So I do want to say that Kipp at some point during the stream does mention Raphael Lataster as being a credentialed historian. He does admit, although with caveats, that you're a credentialed historian, and Robert Price also as a credentialed historian.
Yeah,
so
Price has 2 PhDs, and one in theology and one in New Testament studies. So yeah, I mean, and by the way, like a lot of the Jesus historians that they might consider like important have degrees in like their PhDs are often in theology or New Testament studies, which is an interdisciplinary literary degree, right? So ancient history is exactly on point. So it's kind of silly to say that because you don't have a specific New Testament studies degree, that therefore you can't study it. It's like saying you study ancient history, but you can't talk about Tacitus unless you specifically have a PhD in Tacitus, right? Like that's not how history degrees work. It's not how credentialing works. It's not how any of this works. So they're being hyper specific, and it's a no true Scotsman fallacy. I dealt with this when Bart Ehrman tried to pull it on me. before. He tried to dismiss me as just a classics PhD. My PhD is in ancient history, which includes classics, but it is not a mere classics degree. Although there are important people with classics degrees who write in this subject, who are historicists and ardent defenders of it, that they would praise as yay, that have their PhDs are in classics, right? So it's silly of them to like try and besmirch people's credentials that clearly are relevant credentials, especially when most of the field technically has less relevant credentials for this specific kind of topic.
Right. And I believe it was Hector Avalos is one that did a survey in the End of Biblical Studies.
He agreed that he was 50-50 on the historicity of Jesus. Like he came publicly out on that. That is legitimately doubtable. He didn't do a study on it though. He might have done had he lived. He died of cancer all too young. But yeah, he had a PhD in biblical studies as well.
Well, I guess what I was talking about, not a study. That was the wrong word to use.
You mean like of the credentials of people in the field? Is that what you meant?
Well, right. Not only that, but also the start of New Testament studies and how it started out as like basically an apologetic to protect the faith, and then that's continued until today. So like he does an analysis of the field in general, and I believe that's in the End of Biblical Studies. I can't remember what the subtitle to that is.
And to be fair, like Kipp Davis would push back and say that there's plenty now. There are plenty of secular New Testament studies programs, so they aren't specifically apologetics oriented. I think one has to make a case that they're still affected by that mindset, but it's not automatically the case that it is.
Okay.
What are some of the arguments that you hear both in, well, I don't know if I want to say scholarly circles, given that I don't know that I would say that Richard Carrier's work on this counts as scholarly, but in professional circles, shall we say, and also in just when dealing with people on the internet who have bought into the whole mythicist idea, because I know it's particularly popular on the internet, especially among anti-theist, atheist communities. So what are some of like the typical arguments that you hear there, and why do you find those uncompelling?
I'll just make a point here that while Richard Carrier is a credentialed historian, an ancient historian, problematically, importantly, he has no training at all in early Judaism, early Jewish literature. He can't read the texts in their original languages. And I would even go so far as to say that I have serious questions about how much professional training he actually has in like Christian origins and in the New Testament.
Okay, so this is the juxtaposition point. What do you think so far of
I mean, he's pushed this line of I'm incompetent before, and I take that down on I have a blog on this where people want to go check that out. He's confusing the fact that all Christian literature is in Greek and Latin. It's not in Hebrew or Aramaic. Certainly for all the early Christian literature, anything that's relevant for determining the historicity of Jesus. Now, there are like ancillary documents that pertain to the context and later documents like the Talmud and stuff that are relevant that, you have to look at and so forth and consider. When I do that, though, I don't come up with original scholarship on that. I just repeat what actual experts in those fields say. And Kipp Davis has lied about this repeatedly. And I've thoroughly documented that he's lied about this. I don't say anything new. I'm not some person coming in here and saying, I've got this new theory about the Talmud. No, I just repeat what Talmudic scholars say. And a lot of them say the same things that I say. And this happens again and again. And I think to this point, like, this has been pointed out and shown to Kipp Davis numerous times. So the fact that he's still on this lie means that he's just running the con at this point. He's disinforming the public and basically falsely claiming that I'm doing original scholarship in Jewish studies. I'm not. Insofar as I rely on any Jewish studies, I'm just repeating what the peer-reviewed literature says by actual experts in the field. And then all the original stuff I do is in the Greek and Latin texts and the actual documents for early Christianity.
Yeah. All right. So now this is a juxtaposition point right here. So now they're going to be promoting people that do not have credentials. The first one they cover is Galata, which at the time of writing his review of On the Historicity of Jesus, he didn't have credentials. He was currently in the process of, going through the PhD program, getting his doctorate, and he's since attained his doctorate, but he he didn't at the time have the credentials that that would be on par with, say, what you have when you wrote on the historicity of Jesus.
Yeah, right. So I don't want to
Right.
criticize that though, because I don't think there's anything in Galata's publication that he would change. Like, I don't think he would go back and say, "Oh fuck, now that I have a PhD, I think I made this mistake here." That's not the case. I also happen to know that Galata got a lot of coaching. So there was a lot of other scholars who wanted him to say certain things, and so a lot of his write-up had help of other scholars. So it wasn't just some grad student by himself coming up with stuff. And also, I don't take the position that Kipp Davis does, that people who don't have PhDs can't produce quality peer-reviewed work. I think that's a flag. If they don't have it, you got to take that into consideration. But I've seen several, it's not common, but I have seen several people who aren't fully credentialed who produce really sterling work in this kind of stuff. So I don't think you can just dismiss someone's argument based on their lack of credentials. I think it's a stupid argument. It was an argument started by Bart Ehrman. So when Bart Ehrman complained about me talking about it, I was only talking about it because he started the argument, and I had to respond to his starting of the argument. I normally wouldn't make the argument. So the only reason I ever talk about it is because these assholes talk about it. They're using this stupid ad hominem argument, which is dumb. It doesn't have anything to do with the quality of the arguments and with the value or credit or correctness of them either. So it's more of an excuse to avoid discussing the evidence and the texts and the actual what you call professional academic work in this, which is what peer-reviewed scholarship is. It's professional quality work that you need to actually pay attention to and read, even if you disagree with it, which is fine. But trying to not do with that, like try to avoid it all and not have to talk about it by dishing on someone's lack of credentials, is a stupid argument. But it just shows that they don't have the goods here. This is what they've got. They've got to try and come up with some sort of ad hominem, no true Scotsman fallacy bullshit, rather than dealing with what I actually wrote in the actual study that was approved by actual experts in the field and published by an actual real academic publisher. Same with Lataster too. Like his book, also peer reviewed by Brill. Like it's a prestigious academic publication. So all of this is just dumb, and it just annoys me that they're wasting any time on it whatsoever. But like you said, I think we're getting to their hypocrisy soon. So
right. Yeah. Well, so that's my entire point in pointing this out. It wasn't to say that Daniel can't produce good work even when he didn't have credentials, or that this other person can't either. It's just, I feel like it's a bit
right.
Yeah, the hypocrisy of it, of them criticizing you who has credentials and then promoting, people that don't, or well, at least for Galata at the time didn't have it. I feel like is a bit hypocritical and shows a bit of a cherry picking as far as who they're going to be listening to and promoting.
I hope I'm pronouncing that right, for $20 said, simply put, it makes the best sense of the data sources and rise of ancient Christianity. Scholars disagree on the how, but we all basically agree that the historical Jesus is a part of the how Christianity got going.
Thanks very much, Daniel. So for those of you who don't know, Daniel Galata is actually a recent PhD graduate from the University of Stanford, I believe. He's a scholar of the period. He actually wrote a solid review of on the historicity of Jesus that he had published in the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus. Please let me know if I got all that right, Daniel. Oh, yeah, he says correct. Awesome.
Yeah, it was actually a completely dishonest review and wrong on many points. So people who are interested in that, I do have a whole article on Galata. It was what Galata published was Christian apologetics. It wasn't really a serious critique of the actual argument on the historicity of Jesus. He rarely even mentions the actual arguments in the study in his thing. So anyway, people want to check into that, you can check that out.
Yeah. So what I've got up on the screen right now is I actually went to your review of Galata's review, and then I also had Galata's review up as well. And in your blog article, you pointed out that it starts out with Galata declaring sixth grade math is beyond him and therefore should be ignored. To the contrary, historians need to start learning the mathematical logic they all depend on in every argument they make. Quote, sixth grade math is hard, which isn't a direct quote, but just saying that is not a valid rebuttal to that point. And then I wanted to compare that to what Galata said in the thing in his review. And it says, but despite his call for historians to write with a style more attractive and intelligible to ordinary people, many, myself included, will find Carrier's Bayesian analysis unnecessarily complicated and uninviting. So it seems to me like he's dismissed your entire argument because he doesn't understand the math.
It's funny when you have a historian saying they want to argue something is probable, but they take a big shit on all probabilistic logic. They say, we don't need math. We can just say things. We don't need logic. Fuck logic. We don't need to understand how probability works to reach conclusions in probability. This is a very annoying position to take. No, it is his responsibility, his professional responsibility to understand the logic of probability, because his entire field of study is based on arriving at conclusions about probability. And you cannot do that reliably if you can't even articulate what the underlying logic is, and the underlying logic is mathematical, of how you're getting to your conclusions in probability, or even what your assertions in probability are, and why they are what they are. And so this is a common thing where there's this terror of math, and then they dismiss it. Oh, let's just not do math. Let's just talk out of our ass. And it's not really complicated math. What it does is I make explicit the underlying logic that most scholarship hides under obfuscatory text. So that they'll use vague words like probable, more probable, etc., but they won't explain how they're arriving at those results, or even what those results mean. What do they mean? How much more probable? How probable? And why? Why that probable and not less or not more? And so this is a thing that I think is a big problem across the field of history, and I'm not the only one who's pointed this out. David Hockett Fisher did Historians' Fallacies. Great book, very witty, but he surveys the entire field of all fields of history and finds a lot of examples of this being a problem. So yeah, I think this is kind of like less important than getting at the facts of the issue, but it does illustrate this tendency to make up excuses to dismiss things, and to make up excuses not to examine them, and not to learn them, and not to study them, and not to be able to question them competently. You're just saying, I'm not even competent enough to assess this argument. Therefore, I'm going to slag it off and claim victory. Is not really the way this should go, basically. He should take more time to figure out, like, why is he assigning different probabilities to things than I am? Like, that would be more useful, right? Why do you say the probability is different? Let's walk through that. Let's talk about it. And that's the thing that I just, this is vexing to me in general, but it's a problem across all fields of history. It's not specific to this particular debate.
Right. I do want to just quickly go through the rest of these, because they sort of name drop a few people here. The next one, Daniel Galata actually brings up Simon Gathercole as having a solid paper on establishing a historical Jesus. But I wanted to pull this out of Gathercole's paper, because if you read this, it seems like Gathercole is actually not only arguing against mythicism, but also what mainstream scholars argue about Jesus in general.
Both Gathercole and Galata are Christian apologists. Like, they have that specific agenda. These are not secular scholars. It's worth pointing that out. I also have an article responding to Gathercole. He made a lot of the same mistakes and dishonest maneuvers as Galata did. And I think Gathercole is the one who made the most astonishingly incompetent article on this. And then, it was a complete disaster. Then his peer-reviewed article, clearly he fixed a lot of the mistakes in the original one. So he at least learned some lessons from saying something really, really stupid about this earlier on. And I have articles on both. I have articles on his original article, which was not a peer-reviewed article, and that was a disaster. And then his peer-reviewed article, which is at least follows the standards of the field in terms of how you cite things and argue and so on. So that is a quality article. It's just wrong a lot and disingenuous a lot, and has a lot of apologetical maneuvers in it.
Right. And then finally, there's this other person who is currently doing grad work, and that's Simone, who has their own blog that they run. And so these are just a couple of excerpts from it. This is kind of what made me stop reading, which I don't know if that's a bad thing or not. But in talking about your portion where you talk about how the Talmud supports this suffering and dying Messiah motif prior to Christianity, they say the initial presentation is confusing. The passages are not quoted directly, and there's no analysis nor citation of secondary scholarship. But in the citation for it, not only do they point out how you cite Daniel Boyarin for it, but then they have this part that says, contra some claims, Boyarin does not argue this reading is definitely pre-Christian, but rather that the hermeneutic that produces it is. And then has a few footnote citations, but it's interesting to note here that it's only the first two note citations that make any kind of sense, because then it repeats footnote 10 in the same area, and then something about page 190 footnote 1, and then 158 to 159, but it says 190 note 1 to 158 9, and I just didn't know how to pull that up.
Yeah, right. Okay. It's also false. This is not a correct interpretation of what Boyarin said. Boyarin was very explicit. Like, you could quote him direct. Like, he does say it was a pre-Christian belief. And so when the material she's citing here is where Boyarin makes clear to point out that he's not saying that the entire Christian gospel was invented by Jews, right? He's saying that the concept it was invented, they were using it differently. And so the Christian's own use of this concept is unique to Christianity, just as every religion is unique, right? That's what he says. He didn't say that the Christians were first to come up with this idea. He's saying the idea predated Christians and that they just did this new thing with it, the idea of a dying Messiah. So, and that's his whole book is about this, right? Like, so you can't get this wrong. I think that was a very disingenuous way to put that, and very misleading. I think it's disinformation is what we're getting there. But it's also moot because people complained that I only cited a few. So she says there I cited no one. I cited several people. But also they complain I didn't cite enough people, or they don't like the people I cited, or whatever. So I went and found like some 30 scholars who've all published under peer review these same fucking points. So you can't go around saying that, oh, just Boyarin, he's a weirdo. Or that you read Boyarin wrong, and like this. No. Like, now I could put a footnote in there, and a lot of the stuff that I cite actually was published after me, but not all of it. I found a bunch of other stuff because I went on a thorough deep dive on this to find, because I got the impression from Boyarin that he wasn't totally alone in saying this, and so you know, I found other scholars who were saying it. You know, I cite them in the book. So when people are saying no one thinks this, I was like, really? Because that's not the impression I got. So then I did a deep dive and I gathered, like I said, several dozen scholars who've published under peer review or have commented on their views on this. So it's dumb to just say, oh, he didn't cite anybody. Well, okay, except Boyarin, and he got Boyarin wrong, which is false. But it's also moot because we're not just leaning on Boyarin here. The things I'm saying are well supported by serious scholars who are experts in the Jewish literature, serious scholars who are experts in the Dead Sea Scrolls, serious scholars who are experts in the Talmud. This is not just me by myself. And so it's dumb to keep pushing this argument, right? So anyway, and that's my soapbox on that. But it really annoys me. So people who want to see this, I have an article called Some Controversial Positions That Are Now Mainstream. If you go to my blog, you'll find that, search for that and find it. And I have a section on dying Messiah concepts in Judaism. And I just go through scholar after scholar after scholar after scholar, citing, quoting vastly more extensively than before, really showing up the point, so that, like, they've lost this argument. They've conclusively, decisively lost this argument. They really need to stop using it. It's making them look like they're not doing the work anymore. They're not doing the research. They're not checking their facts.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see. I did have a section on a few points that were kind of hypocritical, but I think I'd rather just go on ahead and get into the arguments that Kipp uses, for one, to support a historical Jesus, but also his arguments against your arguments.
And just before, I'll let people know in advance that Simone that you quoted, I've actually been hired to read through and respond to her entire series on that. I haven't done it yet. So like the quote you showed, I think I only saw someone else mention it before. I haven't actually read her work. So that might have been out of context. I don't know. But I am actually going to do a write-up on this at some point. It'll be several months from now because it's a big project. She wrote quite a lot.
Okay. All right. So the next part is going to be going into the first, I guess, one of the first arguments that Kipp brings up, and it should be no surprise that it's an argument from the Gospels. And so basically, Kipp is going to be making his argument to trust at least portions of the Gospels as being historically accurate to a historical Jesus. Share this tab.
And with the emergence of critical scholarship in and around the late 18th and then in the 19th century, what happened was that this idea of Jesus' existence started to face challenge. People started to say, well, maybe there really was no Jesus. Let's look into this. Let's have a look at this. And the reason for that is because the sources we have as historians, as scholars of the period, they're problematic. So let's just get that out of the way, right? The Gospels.
But before we continue, Rick, I just want to know, like, if you hear somebody say our sources are problematic, what would be like your maybe assumptions, or what would you think that they were? How do you think that the sources are? Do you, like, if they're problematic, do you think that you can very clearly pull information out of them that are historical?
Yeah, I think so. I know personally that from multiple experiences with Kipp Davis, that he says disingenuous things a lot. So he'll say things that are more sarcastic than authentic. So he'll say this and he sounds sincere and stuff, but he's going to take it away in like 5 or 10 minutes, I'm sure, because that's what he does. He'll say something like, oh, well, no one acts like that. And then he acts like that. Or, you know, like he does this a lot. Like this is a common shtick for Kipp Davis. So I don't really take that seriously, like that remark. I don't even think, I think it's more like bullshit. Like I don't know that he even assumes anyone knows what that even means when he says problematic. Like it's like you're trying to concede something without really conceding it by using a completely vague phrase. So coming from Kipp, I consider that a completely useless statement because I don't know what it means. I have no idea what Kipp thinks that means. So there's nothing, I can't comment on it. But if another scholar said that, you know, and which they did. So I'll give you an example. This comes up with Zielska when she did the only peer-reviewed study of Apollonius of Tyana. And she says in there, like, you know, historians, you know, might think that Apollonius was completely made up, and they would be right, except for there's some evidence to actually anchor him to history. But she admits that the evidence is problematic. So like, it's actually legit to like seriously doubt whether Apollonius of Tyana existed. And she says, like, you can really only come down on the side of historicity because we have these few other like external pieces of information that kind of shore up his historicity. Those pieces of information are really weak. And she admits that, right? So she's not saying that we can absolutely definitely agree that Apollonius existed. So I think he existed. I think the preponderance of evidence gets us there, but the evidence is really shitty, and so we really can't be that confident. Like those aren't her words, but it's basically the gist of what she gives on this. So, so that's when I hear historians say the sources are problematic. That's what we get from her, and she even says like the main source, like the equivalent of the Gospels for Apollonius of Tyana, are completely useless for determining his historicity because they're completely fiction, right? So she's just out of the gate. Like, you just can't. You can't use them. They're useless. They're useless. You need data outside of them to corroborate anything in them, like the existence of Apollonius. And we do have a few tiny little things like that that we don't have for Jesus. So anyway, that's a slight seg to answer your question, but we can go on.
Okay.
Are really problematic. Paul's writings on several levels is really problematic. And so, you know, I think the fact that the Gospels are almost, you know, purely theological documents, and the fact that so much of this literature is fairly late, I would say that these are excellent observations, and it's stuff that scholars really need to take seriously. Which is, I mean, this is what I see happening. in the field is the wide recognition by scholars of these problems and the obstacles they create to this study. With regards to the sources, the Gospels are theological fictions. One of the things that New Testament scholars have been doing for over a century now is exploring and coming to a clearer understanding of what these texts are and how much they are programmatic narratives in an effort to explain particular theological points. It's very, very difficult to glean any sort of historical data from these texts because that's just not of any interest to the writers of these texts. Paul's letters make almost no mention of Jesus's actual life and his teachings, and that can be a problem. Third-party attestations to Jesus, such as we find in Josephus or Tacitus or Suetonius, are fairly late. There's nothing contemporary.
Why are you someone who, along with almost the entire rest of the field in this topic, accepts the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth at that minimal level at least? What is the evidence that we have that makes us come to that conclusion?
The New Testament, on some levels, is a product of Judaism. Paul was Jewish. The Gospels purport to have originated from within early Judaism, and I think there's very good reasons to accept that is the case, that is true, and we'll get into some of these a little bit as we go here. So for all their problems, for all the issues that I pointed out above, the fact that the Gospels they're fairly late, all of them, most scholars date to after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. They've been classified as bios, or Greco-Roman biographies, which is probably the closest generic classification for this type of literature, but there's even some issues with that. By and large, I think most scholars accept that the Gospels are sort of like their own thing, and this creates all sorts of problems. These are theologies, these are Christian theologies, which are grounded in the in the life and teachings of Jesus. I think for lack of a better way to describe them. But in spite of all that, the Gospels and the letters written by the Apostle Paul between, I think it's like the year 45 or 47 and the late 50s CE, these are still exceptionally useful sources for studying early Judaism. So as much as the Gospels will caricature Judaism, which is a real problem, they clearly reflect the milieu of first century Palestine. For the issues that are there, these are still really useful sources for helping us to understand what Judaism looked like in the first century in Palestine. So first of all, I'm an historicist because the New Testament is a collection of documents which preserves tons of information about early Judaism, and they make the best sense in view of their actually being an historical Jesus. Our earliest sources, the Gospels, the Apostle Paul, these all indicate that Jesus was an actual person. Even from a fairly rigorous historical examination, we can still walk away with the sense that, yeah, there probably was a guy. So the Gospels are problematic, but they do contain some indicators of being set in actual history. There's a couple of these that I thought I would point to. First of all,
so I'll just stop right there. This is several minutes into being asked the question of, why do you believe Jesus to be historical? And so so far Kipp has said our documents are shit, but we can definitely know that Jesus existed as a historical person from shitty documents that are problematic and are mostly, if not completely, theological fiction.
Right. I assume he's about to, like, right after the pause here, that he's about to explain like how that's possible. Like I can imagine ways that it's possible, and of course I know everything he's talking about. I've studied the literature, I've studied the scholarship, I know everything he's talking about. So I already probably have a good idea of what kinds of things he's going to say, and I also already know why they're bad arguments. But I do want to make clear, if there's anybody new in the audience who isn't up on all of this, that Kipp Davis is not a Christian apologist. He's not coming from this from the perspective of the triumphal position. He's not trying to defend like the resurrected Jesus or the kind of theological. He doesn't want he's not trying to defend the theological Jesus as the actual Jesus, right? He admits that it's buried in myth, and it's almost everything said about Jesus is false. So he's from the minimal historicity perspective, which I think is a valid point to make, especially since oftentimes they'll cite scholars who are triumphalists. They're actually maximalists. They're not minimalists. Because there's a lot of Christian apologists in this field arguing for a historical Jesus. They're arguing for a very, very detailed historical Jesus that has particular things that support their faith doctrine. So you do have to be aware that oftentimes scholars will speak as if they're secular scholars, but really they have that Christian agenda behind them. And often you can't tell. But in the case of Kipp Davis, he doesn't have that agenda. He's not trying to defend the faith or anything like that.
I do have to say that as a third party to this conversation, not, you know, me just saying I'm not like an expert in this field or anything. I do find myself confused by this with Kipp, though, because he regularly aligns himself with people that primarily argue for the magical Jesus, like the magical gospel version of Jesus. Like, you know, he promoted Gather Cole's article on it, which seems to argue for a more magical Jesus. And, you know, he recently did that video or that live stream with James McGrath, who I don't know specifically if he makes a specific argument for a magical Jesus, but I mean, it's kind of seems like he would lean in more of the magical direction.
Yeah, he's a liberal leaning Christian apologist. So McGrath is not, he's not like William Lane Craig or something like that, but or some of these more hardcore, like NT Wright is like seriously hardcore Christian. McGrath is a Christian and he is a Christian apologist. But he's not, he's not a maximalist. I don't think that. I think he would admit that a lot of the stuff about Jesus is mythical, for example.
Okay. Well, and so now he only really lists one argument here as far as the Gospels go.
Right.
And I can't believe that this is an argument. Like, I just can't believe it.
I'm excited. Let's see it. I don't know what it is.
Well, one of the features of the Gospels that I see as particularly interesting and useful in terms of understanding their origins within early Judaism, tracing back to this movement, is the presence of a lot of there's a handful of actual Aramaic words which are preserved within the Gospels that are, you know, not they are transliterated into Greek, but then occasionally also translated. We have examples of these in Mark 5:41, for example, when Jesus raises the daughter of Jairus, I think it's Jairus, from the dead. They understood the world through this Palestinian Jewish lens of Aramaic. So that's, I mean, I consider that to be a fairly useful argument for some of the historicity of elements within the Gospels. So I mean, those are just, you know, some of the things that I see as very much fitting very neatly within an historical model of Jesus as an actual guy.
Okay, so
and with the emergence of critical scholarship.
So sorry, Rick, you're muted.
It looked like you cut some things there.
I did. I was about to explain. So
Okay.
I cut out some information that he was giving, but it wasn't new argumentation. He listed out Jairus, the part of Jairus's daughter. He listed out what Jesus said on the cross at the crucifixion, the Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. But he says that there's different versions of it that have different Aramaic words there. And then I think he listed one more particular spot in the Gospels where Aramaic was used, but I retained the overall argument that he was using here, and that's the argument from Aramaic stuff.
Yeah, it's a really terrible argument. I'm really surprised because this shows that he hasn't read my critique of it on the historicity of Jesus. So again, he's not read the study, so he doesn't know what he's talking about, right? He hasn't read the study that challenges these arguments. He's just repeating the argument, these bad arguments. He doesn't even know they're bad arguments. He hasn't even really thought about them, it seems. Like, so it's in this particular case, that's why I was curious about what you cut, because if it was just a list of examples, okay, that's terrible, because he doesn't explain at no point in what I have seen, what you've shown me, he never explains how you get historicity out of this, right? So how do you get to B from A? I don't follow that, right? So like, let's take the Jairus case. Obvious fiction, right? That never happened. I'm sure if you sat Kipp Davis down and you said, do you think this happened? And you say, probably not. It's a myth. And you can even, I show like the sandwiching and the literary structure of it. It is totally a myth. It's a literarily, artistically crafted story, none of which is believable. Because there's the story of the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years is wrapped around Jairus's daughter. So, and the daughter was 12 years old, and the woman had been bleeding for 12 years. I mean, come on, this is myth. There's a lot of there's scholarship on this and so forth, but it's obvious that you can look at the structure of it. It's a totally mythical story. It never happened. So why would the presence of Aramaic words in it have fuck all to do with the historicity of Jesus. If the story didn't happen, like even if you were to say that, oh, maybe the story existed in an Aramaic form before it was in Greek, but that there's no evidence of that. Actually, the evidence does not support that conclusion. But even if it were the case, that's just fiction in Aramaic, right? Like it's not like I point this out when Bart Ehrman made this argument. Aramaic is not some sort of magical language that somehow forces people to never write fiction. So you can never write Aramaic fiction. Aramaic is a magical language. So if something was written in Aramaic, it has to be true. No, that doesn't follow at all. Like just the fact that it's Aramaic has nothing whatever to do with the historicity of the story, much less of Jesus. So, but the other thing is that we actually have good scholarship on where this comes from, right? So like we know that there were Aramaic targums of the scripture that are being used to, as ways to interpret, like commentaries on. The Targums are paraphrases of the Hebrew scriptures, but they're interesting paraphrases because they're very interpretive. And so those interpretations can then be used to come to conclusions about what the original scripture meant. And so a lot of these throw-ins that Mark is the one who throws these in. These throw-ins could be taken from Targums. It's just another way they're using a source, which has nothing to do with Jesus, but in order to color the way they're actually interpreting biblical texts and the way they're trying to sell the gospel and what the messaging is and all of that stuff. Another example I know he mentioned was the cry on the cross, because you mentioned that. A lot of scholars, like major scholars, like Meyer and some of these other experts in Judaism that have studied Jesus, are quite certain that that's not historical, that actually was fabricated later based on the Psalms, right? Because it's literally a quote from Psalm 22. And it has theological significance. There's a lot of other details from Psalm 22 used to color the story, right? So yeah, maybe they had an Aramaic Targum of the Psalms and they're using that as source material for this. That's entirely possible. We don't know, but the one thing we can't say is that any of this connects to a historical Jesus, right? There's no logical connection between Mark chose to use some Aramaic words, therefore Jesus existed. Like there's a huge gap of nothing in between those two statements. That there's no way to get logically from one to the other. I've talked a lot more about this. I discuss it explicitly. Most explicitly, I discuss it in Proving History, which was my peer-reviewed study of the methodology. I have a whole section on what I call the criterion of our Aramaic, because this is an argument that's been used by several people. And I'm not the only one to criticize it. So like I cite several other scholars many scholars actually have criticized this and pointed out this is a bad argument. We should not be leaning on it. If we want to defend historicity, we need something else. We need to like shove this under the carpet and hope that it doesn't continue to embarrass us in the future, because it's a really, really bad argument. But that's apparently Kipp Davis's lead argument, which is really strange. And he doesn't seem to know any of the criticism, not just mine, but all the other scholarship that criticizes this particular kind of argument. He doesn't know any of it because he doesn't check. He hasn't read my study. He hasn't read Latastra's study. He hasn't read any of the people I cite supporting me on this position. He hasn't read it. He hasn't done any research on this. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And so he knows Aramaic. That's it, right? And so like somehow he knows Aramaic. Mark used Aramaic, and somehow he has an affinity for Mark now. Must be historical because he used Aramaic, and I know Aramaic. I mean, it's an emotive fallacy. It's not a logical argument to a conclusion, and it doesn't show any interaction with the scholarship on exactly this argument and this question. And that's why Kipp Davis is doing a disservice to the public, because he's not doing any research on this. He's not engaging with the studies on this. He's not engaging with the critics of his own position. And like I said, it's not just me. I'm not the only critic. There are actual serious scholars besides me that have criticized this in the mainstream literature. This is not new.
Yeah. And again, from an outside sort of viewpoint here, I feel like in order for this argument to actually like have any impact, for me at least, I would think that you would have to try to make an argument that like only Jesus was speaking Aramaic at the time. Or that.
Good point. Right. I also point that out in my response to Ehrman on this. That is true. Kipp Davis, no, he never made it. That's my point, is he never made a logical argument explaining how his premise gets to the conclusion. So I have no idea, none whatsoever, how Kipp Davis thinks the Aramaic in Mark proves historicity. I don't even know what his thinking is, but he did imply, like you just implied, he implied that no one could put Aramaic in a text unless they were writing in the lifetime of Jesus, because Aramaic, I guess, was only spoken in Galilee, Judea in the early first century, right? Like that, he did imply that. He didn't say that. So like, I'm not going to impute to Kipp Davis a stupid argument like that, but it did seem like that's what he was saying, right? So it looked that way. And that is also true. And Ehrman has actually pretty much outright said that, which is, it's a dumb argument, because Aramaic was spoken for centuries across like 2 continents. So 3, actually, if you count the Aramaic speaking peoples that are in Europe as well. Like Aramaic was kind of the lingua franca of like the Syria region, the whole like Mesopotamia and stuff. Aramaic was very, very common and really broadly spoken across it was probably the 2nd most commonly spoken language in the East after Greek, possibly more than Greek, depending on how you do the stats on the populations, the Greek-speaking population versus the Aramaic-speaking population. One can argue that Aramaic is actually more widely spoken than Greek across the Middle East in the ancient world. But certainly it's right. It's number 2, right? Like at worst, it's number 2 right after Greek. So yeah, it's a dumb thing to say that like, well, only Jesus could speak Aramaic, or only people in the early first century could speak Aramaic, and only in the Holy Land, like no one anywhere else could speak Aramaic. And that's just false. It's completely false. And that's why you can't come to this inference. Like, obviously there were fluent Aramaic speaking peoples when Mark was writing, when Matthew was writing, when Luke was writing, when John was writing, millions of them, right? So across, like I said, 3 continents. So we're talking Africa, Europe, and Asia, Middle East and Europe. So yeah, so so like I said, I didn't want to impute to Kipp Davis that really, really, really stupid argument. So I hope that's not what he meant. But yes, if someone got that impression, that is a really, really dumb argument.
Well, knowing how Kipp has argued in the stream in general, it kind of seems like he would be appealing to previous groups and their traditions. And because their traditions were in Aramaic, then most likely they got it like at firsthand knowledge of this Aramaic source.
Sure,
so
that's the charitable reading. So that's why I responded as if that was his argument. And originally, that was my original response just now. But the problem with that is that it's assuming that nobody, like, you can't make stories up in Aramaic. It's also assuming that you believe the Jairus story is true, which is bonkers. Like, I don't know what anyone would think that's a historically true story. And the idea that the cry on the cross was ever witnessed or recorded, or was that particular phrase that Jesus is dying and he just takes the trouble to quote Psalms 22 in a story that like heavily relies on the details of Psalms 22 for its construction. I don't see like that as a really sound argument. Like even if that was the argument, that's also a bad argument. Like, it's not a good argument. It's just not a really stupid argument in the way that the only early first century Palestinians spoke Aramaic. That would be a really dumb argument. But even the more like the less dumb argument, which is like, well, maybe it must be true if it goes back. But we're not saying these stories go back to the truth, so you can't get historicity out of them, right? Like, it's clearly, if they come from an earlier story at all, they come from fiction composed orally or not in Aramaic, and it's just fiction in a different language, and it doesn't get you history, right? You can't get to history from there. I don't even think that's the case. I think there's no evidence that these stories were originally composed in Aramaic and then translated. When like Mark is clearly writing original composition in Greek, and then he throws in some words, and the words are definite throw-ins. They're not like integral to the narrative. The same with the cry on the cross and all of that. So I think definitely Mark is making use of Aramaic materials that have nothing to do with Jesus, like the Targums, for example. Or possibly Mark just knows Aramaic and likes to throw shit in. I think that's less likely. Mark clearly loves to emulate scripture a lot. Like, he likes to take details from scripture and put them in the story. We know he does that extensively from the Septuagint. So here he would be doing it from the Targums.
Yeah. So I know that Kipp knows about the connection to Psalm 22 for the cry on the cross at the very end. But I think he still has this assumption in there that it like originates from an earlier group that had some kind of reliable tradition, and so I feel like that's an assumption that he makes about
Oh
it.
yeah, totally right.
Yeah.
Like I have, even if you could prove it, right? Let's say we found an Aramaic preceding document to Mark, and let's say it was just literally Mark in Aramaic, and that we could show somehow. Let's say we could prove that Mark is a Greek translation of that Aramaic. That gets us nowhere because it's all clearly just as fictional, like he just said. Like it's the Gospels are all theological fictional documents. Whether it was written in Aramaic or not, it's still the same. It's still the same garbage as a source. So that you can't get from there to historicity. There's a huge gap that he's not crossing with any logic, and that's the problem with it. And that's why this argument is no good. It's a really bad argument.
Yeah. Now, so this next section I've dubbed as the argument from dissent. And so we're going to be talking about Paul's work. He has a couple of different examples and rebuttals to your particular arguments for these particular sections of Paul. And so this first part is going to be about dissent, like what Paul says about Jesus's dissent and all this other stuff.
I'm going to go back again here to just Paul's presentation of Jesus. Paul is our earliest source for Jesus, for early Christianity, and there are a handful of really important key texts that indicate very clearly that he understood Jesus to have lived and died on earth. The sources we have as historians, as scholars of the period, they're problematic. Paul's writings on several levels is really problematic.
Sorry, I cut that in there a little bit snarky, I guess, but the whole
correct. It was, you were right to do so. Yeah.
Yeah. The whole fact that he's like, oh, these sources are problematic, but we can clearly see a historical Jesus in there.
Yeah, that is a contradictory position.
I'll pull up three of them. These are three very, very popular, very well known passages because of this discussion. First of all, in Romans chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, Paul introduces himself as a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, the gospel concerning his son, who was descended from David according to the flesh. So this is a fairly straightforward, very easily understood within the text language and culture of the period to be an expression of Jesus' humanity, his existence on earth. One of the
I know you have.
Hold on. Does he elaborate on that at all, or
Yes.
does he just move on?
Well,
Okay.
So the next section is argument from birth, where he heavily deals with that particular passage in Paul, but he mentions it on the outset right here.
I mean, he's already mistranslating, right? The word dissent is not in the Greek.
It gets even worse.
Okay. I'm just curious because I don't know. Does Kipp even know Greek really? Like I've never been clear on that.
I know. So
either two things are going on here. Like either he didn't check or didn't care. I guess there's three possibilities. He didn't check, or he didn't care, or he does know the Greek and he's deliberately misleading the audience as to what the Greek says by trusting a disingenuous, a contentious, tangentious translation.
I think you'll be surprised because I know I had a personal conversation with Kipp before all this bullshit started, and he seemed to know how to look up Greek words, and
all right, that's
very
yeah,
he knows how to look up Greek words, and he does know like the Greek word that Paul uses here, that it's different than how he speaks about other births,
right?
And he knows the two different ways in which genomai is used.
Okay, so is he going to get into that? Is that coming?
Yeah.
Okay,
that's coming.
All right, then good. That's good to hear.
One of the things that mythicists must contend with are these statements by Paul, which appear to clearly indicate that Jesus was a human being. What Carrier does when he encounters this text is he says, "Well, Paul's not actually saying that Jesus."
Yeah,
sorry. This is a common fallacy, and I'm going to write that down because I want to make sure I get that right. Clearly indicate that Jesus was a human being. So that is my position. I actually think that Paul did think that Jesus became a human being. He's conflating evidence that Paul believed Jesus was a human being with evidence that Jesus was on earth. Like, so there's a fallacy here that human being means on earth. There's a step there that's missing, right? Like, is this idea that you can't be a human being anywhere else. When you have like the ascension of Isaiah and in some other stories where you have, for example, let's take the life of Adam and Eve, where Adam and Eve start out in the third heaven, in where the real Eden is, the actual paradise. And when they fall from Eden, they literally fall from the third heaven to earth, to the poor copy of Eden down on earth, right? So it's a poor copy of the true garden up in heavens. So Adam and Eve were human beings in the third heaven, even, which is pretty high up there, definitely far away from earth. So being a human being does not entail being on earth. You need an extra piece of evidence to get to earth on this. And I don't know, like, if he's aware that he's making this fallacy, but you want to pay attention to that, because anytime he shows evidence that Paul believed Jesus was a human being, that does not get what he needs. That does not get you evidence that he thought Jesus was ever on earth. So you need an extra step. You need something else. I'm sure he's going to try for that, but just be aware that particular phrase is misleading.
Yeah, he definitely does not seem to understand what your argument is as far as Jesus's body and how and just everything concerning like what Paul thought about Jesus's body.
Descended from David, because the word there is ginomai, which can be translated in certain contexts as made, or as he puts it, manufactured. So what Paul is actually saying here.
So I've looked this up just in my own books that I have, and I'm sorry for stopping so quick, but I did want to share this. So this is the Liddell Scott Greek lexicon. Yeah. And so this is the entry for what is ginomai. It's, it changes. Greek's kind of a complicated language as far as I understand it. So you can use it in a couple of different ways, and it's used in a couple of different ways across Greek literature. One is if you're explicitly talking about like a person, it is, the connotation is to be born. But if it's about things or objects, it's to be produced is what the definition is, which is like that would be our modern sense of manufacture.
Yeah, and to give you an example, when Josephus describes Adam and Eve, he uses this of God's manufacture of Eve, right? He says she's made, ginomai. So there's an example of a human who's made by God. And there are other examples. That's just the clear cut example. I actually talk about this now, unrelated to Kipp Davis. I think it was maybe it wasn't. Now I think, oh no, it was Dadpool. I think it was Captain Dadpool, or maybe it was Tim O'Neill. I don't know. One of these.
They all use the same bullshit arguments.
Yeah. They're right. Anyway, on my blog, I do talk about ginomai and how they're misusing it. And I think it was O'Neill. Who said, "You'll never find it being used as manufacturing anywhere."
That was O'Neill.
Yeah. So I'm like, challenge accepted, because I fucking know Greek and I absolutely know that it is used that way a lot. But let's do this, bro. So I go on my blog and I have an article, a whole section on this, where I go through showing the uses of the word. And I find and he says, like, you'll never find it in Josephus. That's not his exact phrase, but it was basically implying Josephus never uses it. I'm like, yes, he does. I found it in chapter 1. Right, the first hit, like bam, right there. But I show other examples of it being used for manufacture. I show examples, for example, Eve, where it's very, very clearly used for the manufacture of a human being. So there's no dispute about what it can mean. And it's important to point out that it really, the root meaning is just come to be. So it doesn't actually have the meaning of born or manufactured. It just means come to be. So like a non-tangentious, non-hypothesis ridden translation would just say come to be. It wouldn't say descended. That's why descended is a bad translation, because it's interpretive. It's applying theology to the text that's not actually in the text. The text does not say descended. There are words that they could have used that would mean descended, if that's what he meant. No, he chose this weird word that is normally not used in this context. And that's the other thing I show with Tim O'Neill, is that the idioms that they think are being used, they typically use genao, which is a very specific meaning beget, which means born. And Paul uses these idioms, but Paul himself pulls out genao and puts in ginomai. Like, he's changing the word. He's being a weirdo. And this is when you say like Paul's is problematic. Like, this is problematic. Paul is being weirdly vague, like weirdly. And there's nothing normal about this. And so that this should red flag the fuck out of this, right? Like, we shouldn't just be assuming we know what Paul means, because Paul himself is deliberately being weird in the way that he's deciding to phrase these things. He's being very cagey. He's being very indirect. Like, he could have just said descended from David. He could have even said, like, as the genealogy is proved, or whatever, right? Like, he could have said something that was very explicit and made very clear that he believed in the genealogical descent of Jesus as a Davidic king, which I think if Paul had done that, like, that would be really good evidence for historicity. But Paul doesn't do that. He does this weird other thing instead. And that's really suspicious. And I think people need to have their radar come up and go, okay, when Paul does something really suspicious like this, when he's cagey, I don't think you can go talking about what he clearly means. He clearly does not clearly mean anything. He non-clearly means something. And so, like, figuring that out is a whole other challenge. But that's an example of why Paul is problematic and why this is not a straightforward argument for historicity. It is problematic in a lot of ways. There's other problems with this that I get into in other writings that I've done, and obviously in the study that Kipp Davis has clearly still never read, where I talk about this. But that's just start one with the wording of this.
Yeah, and so I've got Philippians 2:6-11 brought up here.
Good example, right?
Yeah. So, and just to read through this, for anybody that can't see it, who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, using genomai when referring to his human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, which I may mention this later if we can get to it. But I feel like that's kind of an important part to Paul's theology as far as
there's a lot of debate about that last line, though. So,
it?
Yeah. There's which name is meant. That there's a lot of scholarship, a lot of ink has been spilled on that.
Okay.
But this is important. So this is the NIV. You pulled this straight out of the NIV, right? The New International Version. So here we have a super mainstream translation, outright using ginomai of a human being made, right? So, like, this isn't me. I didn't come up with this, right? Like, this is like an actual serious biblical translation committee fucking decided that they're going to put in the NIV made. Like, they made that call. It's not me. Like, they're doing it correctly. Like, they're reading the text more literally, as they ought to do, rather than interpretatively. So when Kipp quoted "descended from David," that's a highly interpretive translation. It's not an accurate translation. There are accurate translations. There's a lot of, like, Bibles today. You go look at them, like some of the good translations will not say descended. They will say came to be or something like that. They will put a neutral text there, a neutral translation, which they should do. It is super disingenuous of Kipp Davis to use a tendentious translation that is not what the text says, and not admit that that's the case. It's like, that is a very misleading translation. You can admit that and still try to argue what Kipp Davis argues, but it bothers me that Kipp Davis won't even acknowledge that, won't even inform the audience that is the case. Like he seems to be like playing a shell game here with words.
Yeah, and I feel like the stronger argument in their favor, and you can correct me if I'm wrong there, Rick, is how I've heard it, how I've heard some people get around this, in that this idea, God made Jesus's body in the womb of Mary, and then was physically born on earth.
Yeah, but that's not what Paul says, right? So,
exactly.
Yeah,
I
actually make this argument myself, and this is important because when you look at the Gospels, they have the genealogy of Joseph, and contrary to Christian apologetics, both Luke and Matthew only give the genealogy of Joseph. They do not give the genealogy of Mary, and yet Mary's baby is called the seed of David, right? So how is that? How did the semen of Joseph get into Mary and make the baby Jesus so that he could be the scion of David. How did that happen? How do you think that happened? Magic, right? So if God could magically do that, well, fuck, the gate's open, right? He could do all kinds of things with the semen of Joseph or any other person, right? So that's the thing, is like, even the authors of the Gospels, even Matthew and Luke, even they agree that God manufactured the fetus, manufactured the body of Jesus out of the seed of David, that he took the seed of David magically from somewhere, whether it was Joseph's balls or someone else's balls. He took the seed, God magically did this and inseminated Mary with the magical semen transfer to manufacture the body of Jesus. And that's so even the authors of the Gospels, the most orthodox, conservative point of view, earliest point of view that we have in narrative form, they even agree with me that God manufactured the body of Jesus out of the semen of David. Now they don't explicitly say how God did that or where he got the semen from, whose balls he got it from. It doesn't matter. This is what they're saying. And you can't go around claiming that this is stupid or silly or whatever, because that's what they said. It's what they fucking said. So that's what they believed. Right. So this is a fact. This isn't something I made up. But if God can do that, well, then he doesn't need a womb, does he? He can make the body anywhere, just as he did with Adam and Eve. Remember, he didn't need a womb for that. He didn't need to gestate Adam and Eve in a sort of fabricated womb, like a, artificial womb, like some sort of alien technology. No, he just fucking made Adam and Eve, full on, straight up. So if God can do that, he can do it, and he made it out of other material, but he could do it with anything. God can do anything. He's omnipotent, right? So anyway, these points are relevant, and I think this kind of stuff is sort of flippantly dismissed or ignored when people like Kipp Davis are dealing with this particular argument.
Yeah, and I do want to point out, it may or may not be relevant, but even Bart Ehrman has turned around on this particular position a little bit, because in How Jesus Became God, he actually has a section talking about Philo and Philo's beliefs, and one of those beliefs is that God actually manufactured Moses's body and sent Moses down to earth, did everything, and then ascended back up into heaven after he died. And so Bart does not agree about Jesus's body being manufactured by God in the heavens and all that kind of stuff, but he does acknowledge that this was a belief in Jewish thought prior to Christianity. Not the Jesus, but just the manufacturing of bodies and stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. So we will have a little bit more in-depth, because he does have some in-depth criticism of the whole born aspect to it and everything. But he's got more to say about this whole descent idea.
Here is that Jesus was manufactured from David, from the sperm of David, or the seed of David, as literally says in the text. According to the flesh.
Tortured reading.
Yes, it is, and I'll explain a little bit here why in a minute. But then Richard does something else. He goes and he pulls up a tractate from the Babylonian Talmud that appears in Nida 16b. So what this rabbinic tractate is, or I should say the interpretation.
Sorry, just in case you're wondering, the only part that I cut out there in that particular edit was he read the tractate, or the little section or whatnot. So he just read it verbatim.
Yeah.
Of a rabbi. What Rabbi Hanina Bar Papa is saying is that there's this angel of conception. The angel's conception is named Night. And what he does in coitus is he will grab a drop of semen. He brings it before God and says, tell us what kind of a person this is going to be. So Richard takes that tractate and then basically makes this argument. Look, Jews believed weird things. They believed that, you could do stuff like this with sperm. Ergo, it stands to reason that you could read this passage from Romans chapter 1 as if God has collected sperm from David and held on to it. And then at the right moment, he made Jesus out of it.
But this is also just verbiage that's typical of when you're just discussing normal human conception.
Well, that's just it, right? So what the passage says, and this is part of the huge problem here. One of the things that Richard makes a big deal of is the fact that Paul, when he's speaking of Jesus and Jesus' existence and his birth, uses this Greek word ginomai, where
before he moves on to the ginomai part right here, I was just so Carrier. I feel like that is a sort of bastardization of your argument in OHJ. And I'm just kind of wondering if you can explain what your argument is as far as arguing for
right.
all that.
So whenever people argue about this, if they don't talk about the prophecy of Nathan, they're either hiding things from you as an audience, or they don't know what they're talking about. So that is absolutely crucial to understanding Romans 1:3, because Romans 1:3 is a definite, direct allusion to Nathan, because it actually uses some of the vocabulary of this. So the idea of the seed of David, literally the semen of David, that comes from this prophecy. There's no other scripture that has that phrase or this concept. So so first of all, there's that. So the prophecy is there, right? So this is why this is the key part of this argument. Now, I want to point out that what the way that Dino and Davis are taking it, and maybe they're just being lazy. Maybe they're not seriously looking at how the argument works. Maybe they don't understand how logic works. I don't know what the reasoning is. But they seem to think that my argument is that simply because ginomai can mean all of this, right? The God took semen and all of that stuff, simply because it could mean that, therefore it's 50-50, therefore we can't tell what he means. That is not the argument. And the reason why that's not the argument is very clear when you see that I quote Nathan. Why is Nathan's prophecy relevant here? The reason it's relevant is that this is one of the few very, very explicitly clear messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. Like, there's a lot of prophecies in the Old Testament that were never originally messianic, but were later taken to be messianic. And so one can argue about which passages were messianic and so on. Kipp Davis likes to argue that Isaiah 52-53 was never messianic, and like 30 fucking scholars disagree with him. But anyway, you can have that argument, but this you cannot argue about. This is a messianic prophecy. There is no doubt, which means that there is absolutely zero messianic Jews who could believe Jesus was the Messiah, but did not fulfill this prophecy. So do you understand the logic there, right? Like it is impossible for Jesus to be the Messiah unless you believe, however you believe it, that this is true, that this prophecy is true. And so this creates a particular evidential logical problem. Whenever you have a hypothesis, so the way you tell whether evidence is evidence for or against a hypothesis, this is why the logic of probability is so fucking important, is you have to ask, okay, what is the hypothesis? And what does the hypothesis by itself, just by itself, what does it predict given background information that is indisputable, like Nathan's prophecy? So if you take the hypothesis plus Nathan's prophecy and the fact, which is a fact, background fact, that all Messianic Jews, which would include Paul and all Christians, that Messianic Jews, or all early Christians, I should say, or the first Christians, all Messianic Jews would agree and therefore have to believe that Nathan's prophecy was fulfilled by Jesus. Once you combine those two facts, you can predict from mythicism, just from the hypothesis itself, the bare hypothesis, that the probability that Paul would believe that Jesus was manufactured out of the seed of David is 100%, right? 100%. Because he has to fulfill this prophecy, and that's it. Like if there's no historical Jesus, there's only one way to do it, and that's this. Now there's metaphorical ways and stuff, but it still has to fulfill this prophecy, whether it's fulfilling it ontologically, like through the actual literal use of semen, or is it metaphorically? It doesn't matter. The probability that Paul believes that Jesus fulfilled this prophecy is 100%, even if Paul knew Jesus was not an earthly person. So that's why this passage in Romans is not usable as evidence, because to get this to be evidence for historicity, it has to have a probability below 100% on the non-historicity hypothesis. There's a logical reason why that is. There's absolutely no way. You can't have a probability above 100%, so you can't get this evidence to be more likely on historicity than mythicism. You just can't. It's logically impossible. So this is a fact of logic. Like, it's impossible. You cannot do it. So that's my argument. And that's why my point is not that we can know what Paul means here. My point is that we cannot know what Paul means here, because Paul has to say this no matter the fucking what. He has to say it. So it doesn't matter what he thinks about where Jesus was created or how he was born or anything. It doesn't matter. Zero matter. He has to say this regardless. And because he has to say this regardless, it gives us no information about what he believed. because, right, like, so it doesn't matter. Whatever thing he believed, he would say this. So therefore, this is not evidence of what he believed. It doesn't tell us which thing he believed about Jesus. So this passage is not usable as evidence. That's my argument. I don't say that Paul absolutely definitely means this, or that he probably meant this, or any of it. My whole point is that we cannot know, because Paul had to say it anyway. And there are plausible background-based reasons how he could mean this without a historical Jesus that are rooted in actual Jewish tradition and even pre-Jewish tradition, because we have this also in Zoroastrianism. Pre-Christian Zoroastrianism has the idea of the semen of Zoroaster was preserved in a magical lake for thousands of years, and then the Messiah would be born. The virgin would go bathe in the lake, and she'd be impregnated by the seed that had been sitting there in this, magical lake sperm bank. And then she would give birth to the Messiah. Like, that's Zoroastrian belief. So this is, and Zoroastrianism, Persian Zoroastrianism, had a lot of influence on Judaism and so on. So this is totally plausible in context. But the key thing is that there's no other thing Paul could say, and therefore this is not dispositive evidence. It doesn't tell us what he thought was behind all of this, because we know he has to think this no matter what anyway. So that's the key argument. And I can understand maybe if you're lazy, or if you're not good at logic, that maybe you'd miss the actual argument, not understand how it works, even though it's in the text, and I'm very careful to explain it. But one of the clues to me is, like, if they don't mention the Nathan prophecy, then they're clearly not addressing the argument. And that tells me that they don't understand the argument, and they haven't even tried to understand the argument. So anyway, that answers your question, I hope.
Yes, it definitely does. And one of the ways that I've received pushback from certain people, like on Twitter and everything like that, it seems like they always fall back on this assumption of what's the most natural reading. And so they base what I feel like that's saying is, well, we have this assumption, and this assumption works perfectly fine for it. So if it's not broke, then no need to try to fix it.
It's failing to understand how the laws of probability work, how evidence works logically to prove a conclusion. And that's why you can't dismiss the 6th grade math as the previous author you cited says. You can't. So you have to understand the logic of evidence. So this is why the Nathan prophecy is absolutely central to this. Like, it's essential to it. So you can say it's natural. Well, but the thing is like, what you're forgetting is that it doesn't matter how natural that reading is. What matters is, what is the probability that Paul would say it? That's the only thing that matters. What is the probability that this is what he would say? And there are 100 different things he could have said that would be very improbable on mythicism. He somehow gerrymandered his choice of words to choose, like, one of the only ways he could say it that would be true on mythicism. That's really weird, right? So that's deeply suspicious. But it doesn't tell us what he thought. It just tells us he's being vague about what he thought. But the thing is like, this cannot be evidence for any particular thinking on his part, because he had to say it no matter what the hypothesis is, no matter what the truth is about the historicity of Jesus. And so that's why it's not usable as evidence. It's not because we get to assume he meant an unnatural thing. That's not how the argument works.
Right. And I do have this quote from your book, because one thing really peeved me about how Kipp tried to steel man the argument, I guess, that you were making. And that's that it seemed like he was saying, well, Richard Carrier has to assume genomai means this strange meaning. And then he uses these Jewish legends that develop so much later, and then he builds an argument based on all of this illogical stuff. Now, that's how I took it. And so that's why I pulled this particular part out from On the Historicity of Jesus, because a lot of people seem to think that you bank a lot on this later Jewish legend, but you specifically say it's a later Jewish legend.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that in the first edition, 2014, I was using a different tractate with the demonic semen stealing, which is more evidence of this, right? Because it says, imagine demons running. I found the Nida passage later where they found God's actual angel is doing this shit, right? And so in the new edition, the revised edition, which came out in 2023. So if you buy a physical, like a print edition of On the Historicity of Jesus, it hasn't been updated in Kindle, but the print edition has updates, and so it actually adds the Niddah reference in the 2023 revised edition, which I had put it in the Jesus from Outer Space, which came out in 2020. And I'd mentioned it on my blog earlier than that, but I discovered that later. So now the new revised edition of On the Historicity of Jesus includes the one that Kipp's talking about, which I think is really good. Like, it's better evidence even than the evidence that I had before, and also the lake evidence from Zoroastrianism. Some other people pointed that out to me. I didn't know about it, and they pointed. I checked the sources and stuff, and yeah, it's legit. So that's also a citation worth pointing out. So we're accumulating evidence of this being a thing that people believed. So you can't say that it's something they couldn't believe, which would be another way to argue this, and to say, like, it's improbable that they would ever believe this, right? That's the other way to argue it. But the fact that we have examples of them believing it refutes that, right? So there's evidence that they did believe things like this. But also, even if we didn't have it, like, God can do anything. We have lots of references to God's powers being absolute, and God doing very weird things with his power, like make Adam out of some dirt, right? Like, he takes some dirt and makes Adam. I mean, if you can do that, come on. Like, why would you think, like, is there some sort of magical cosmic power that prevents God from magically, putting some sperm in stasis to fulfill a prophecy? No, like, there's no basis for saying that any Jew would think that's improbable. He would say, of course God could do that. Like, there would be no Jew who would ever say, no, God could never do that. God is limited in power. He cannot. No, that's not going to happen, right? So, like, their position is kind of patently ridiculous from the position and the perspective of the people we're talking about. The people we're talking about believed in an all-powerful magical wizard who could fucking do anything. So you can't argue that they thought that he couldn't do this. Right? Like, it's just, that's a non-starter as an argument. But that is sometimes the way the argument gets framed when they try to critique this.
Right. I mean, God could have done that thing. You know how Loki in the Marvel movies, he just makes things disappear, and they just, I don't know where they go in the ether, and then he just makes them reappear. Like, it literally anything is, I feel like, is up for grabs in that.
Well, Galen actually complained about Christians and Jews, like Christian and Jewish theology. Like, he complained that they thought God could do anything, like make a horse out of ashes. I think he literally says a horse out of ashes. And he says, that's ridiculous. A God couldn't do that. And then he goes on to explain how God does miraculous things, right? Like how God makes the complex nerve system inside the neck bones of the skull. And he has this elaborate theory about how God can do it. But Galen believed that God was limited by physical laws. Like, there's certain things that God just couldn't do because he had to set up some sort of system to make it happen. So God was powerful, but he wasn't all powerful. But he complains about the Christians and Jews for believing that God could do even ridiculous things, like make a horse out of ashes. And that just illustrates the point that, yeah, that's what they thought. This is the mindset of the people we're talking about. And so if you're looking at this religion from the perspective of the people who are in it, then the modern complaints and hand wringing and making fun and all of that stuff is completely anachronistic and is completely out of context. They're not looking at it from the perspective of the actual people we're talking about. And you can't understand early Christianity if you're not looking at it from their perspective. If you're looking at it from your perspective today, you've already lost the game. You failed as a historian. That's not how you understand ancient religion generally.
Right. All right. They get a little bit more on this point.
What's going on?
Huh?
I'm not seeing it. It's not playing.
Oh, crap. Sorry. I forgot to hit share.
Let
me go back to.
Yeah, we didn't see it at all.
There's a small handful of places where Paul refers to other people's birth using another word, which means just to be born, genao. The two words are actually related in Greek. But the word genomai is just an extremely flexible, ubiquitous word. I mean, the general translation, the general meaning of genomai is to be or to become. Mm-hmm. So, as I said to a mythicist once, it's virtually impossible to build a theology or a worldview on the basis of a word as ubiquitous and flexible as to become.
Which is as true of his
Always
position
saying
as
that
mine. If it's impossible, Kipp, that applies to you as well. Sorry, you can't build historicity on an impossible task, can you? That's actually my point, right? Is like, it is impossible to extract from this the information that either of us need. So that's it. That's the argument. And he just inadvertently confirmed my logic and the point.
Yeah, and I had a little bit of contention when he said that there's a small number of references to his use of Genao. Like I feel like
I assume he means, I don't think he's being contentious there. I think he's saying what I said, which is that Paul uses Genao whenever he does clearly refer to human births. He does every time. Mm-hmm. There's no instance in which Paul refers clearly to human birth, like undisputably, and uses ginomai. He always uses Genao consistently. And this bothered Christians later. Like, it was a serious issue, which is why scribes kept trying to change the words. They wanted to flip ginomai in Romans and Galatians. I assume we're going to get to Galatians 4 later. But the scribes tried switching the word from ginomai to Genao. So that shows that they understood what we're talking about here. That they understood that it was weird. What Paul was saying was weird, and it was problematic, and they needed to fix it. And they needed Paul to say what Kipp Davis wants Paul to have said. And they did that by switching the words out. And we have this in the Creed of Ignatius. When Ignatius builds out the creed that you have to declare, and declare all Christians anathema who don't agree with his creed, he switches out, when he quotes the Seed of David line, or paraphrases it, he swaps out ginomai for Genao, right? So like when you need it to be born, they knew how the fuck to change the text to say born, right? They knew this was a problem. And we have to react to that. We have to accept the consequences of this fact, that if even they knew this was a problem, we need to start talking about it as being actually the problem that they knew that it was. And if they knew that they had to switch the verbs out, that tells us a lot about what the verbs, how they understood what the verbs actually meant. They were threatened by exactly the point that I'm making, that Paul deliberately got rid of Genao and put in ginomai in these phrases that normally were not phrased that way. So Paul has deliberately janked these common phrases, and we need to ask why he did that. Why did he use such a weird way of saying these things? Why did later Christians freak out about this and try to change it back? That's like, you can't just sweep this under the rug. Like, this is serious, relevant information in understanding this.
I totally agree. So he's got about 30 more seconds here. So I'll just let that play.
Says that Jesus was, using ginomai, descended from, and that's spermatos, the seed of David. And this reflects a very common way within the Hebrew scriptures to express natural descent. The Hebrew word,
that's actually false.
Sperm.
This is false, right? So he's glossing over the ginomai. Now that word has magically disappeared, and he's saying, like, yeah, coming from the sperm, and it doesn't use the word, and doesn't use any Hebrew word that aligns with coming from. So it's not the same phrase. It just says from. So like the Hebrew phrase, also in Greek, like in the Septuagint, it just says ek, like ek spermatos. So it's just from. That's it. Just from the sperm of. It doesn't have ginomai or any matching word like that. So the weird thing is that Paul put ginomai there. So Kipp Davis is skipping over the weird thing and pretending that Paul used a common idiom, when that is exactly what Paul did not do. He janked the idiom. And we have to ask, why did Paul jank it? Right? That's the question here. And that's why this is a suspicious passage and a problematic passage. But yeah, continue.
Or seed is very frequently used just to indicate descendants.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's pretty literal in that sense, right? We don't need lots of weird interpretations to understand this. And that's one of the things that bugs me is like, look, you can have all sorts of crazy interpretations if you want, but if you want to convince someone else that your interpretations are reasonable, and I come to this text and it's just using relatively ordinary language to talk about human, ancestor-descendant relationships, you're gonna have to do a lot to convince me that I should actually take this ordinary word in some extreme.
Key point: it's not right. So I keep pointing out that Paul puts this ginomai there that he's janked it. It's no longer a normal phrase. This is Paul's phrase. It's a weird phrase. It's no longer, it's clearly an echo of the phrase that they're talking about, but it is no longer that phrase. So it is not the standard phrase. So I think they've got themselves in their heads that this is a standard phrase, but it's not. And I think it's largely Kipp's doing. I think he's disinformed Dino. And I don't know if Kipp himself is aware that he's doing this, but he's skipping over the one thing that is actually a deviation from the idiom. And that deviation, you have to ask why. And why, not only why did Paul deviate from the idiom, why did later Christians freak out over his deviating from the idiom and try to fix it? Like these are the issues that we need to grapple with, and that they're completely ignoring. And so, yeah, they're sort of creating this sort of foundation to take the position they're doing by ignoring all the actual evidence I presented for the alternate position.
And I think that there's another faulty assumption here, and that's what Paul meant by being descended from the sperm of David. Because I believe you mentioned it earlier that there's this assumption that inherently means born on earth. But, I feel like we have to ask the question of what did Paul mean to be made from the seed of David? Like, could I believe that the stronger argument is alluding to like how Paul talks about all Jews are children of Moses or
seed of Abraham.
Seed of Abraham. Mm-hmm. And so in like, I feel like that's probably a little bit stronger argument to allude back to that. But I feel like the question of, well, what did he exactly mean by this being made of the sperm? Like what rules out the idea that God literally made Jesus out of the sperm of David? Yeah. Like he had the sperm of David.
Considering that Matthew and Luke both agree he did, right? This is like he literally made the body of Jesus out of the sperm of David. We don't know how he did it. They don't get into the details, but they clearly believed it because there was no fucking, so there was no descent, right? There's no descent from Joseph, zero. So even they agree that God did something, and it was weird. So you can't say that that's not natural, or that was out of context, or that that's anachronistic, or that we made this up. No, we didn't make this up. The Christians made this up, and the Christians are the ones showing that their panic at the wording of Paul, like that. That's the that's the evidence we have to take into account. And they're just, of course, gliding over all of this. They're not mentioning any of it. And by not mentioning any of it, this creates disinformation. So they're basically disinforming the public by not actually honestly representing what the argument is, what the actual evidence is that they're supposed to be addressing, but they're completely ignoring, and skipping over the actual details that matter to try and represent things as they are not, like claiming that this is just a normal idiom. It is not a normal idiom. It is a weird transformation of a normal idiom. And that's why it needs to be addressed more competently and honestly than they're dealing with here. I can't really blame Dino because I don't, he himself confesses he doesn't have any relevant skills here. So he's all the victim of Kipp Davis here. Like Kipp Davis has the moral responsibility to correctly inform Dino of these things, and he's not. He's dropping that ball for whatever reason.
All right, so this next short segment is I've dubbed it "Argument from Birth," and I think I believe Kipp is going to be going into a bit more specific arguments concerning like what Paul meant by Jesus being born of a woman.
Yeah.
And finally, later in Galatians, in chapter 4, verse 4, he makes a similar attestation as in Roman to the existence of Jesus as a man. So this expression, born of a woman, is it appears a little bit differently when Paul uses it, but it reflects a very commonly.
It appears very differently when Paul does it, but it's a very common phrase. Notice that's cocaine is a hell of a drug. that's just like fucking Chappelle, the show clip. But he literally just contradicted himself within the span of 2 seconds. But anyway, that's just his point. He mentioned the fact that Paul janked the idiom, but then he forgets that he just said that last second, and then immediately goes on to claim that Paul's just using a standard idiom. And that's exactly what just happened right in front of us. So anyway, you can proceed with them.
Yeah, I feel like the argument that he makes here, you're going to be maybe not surprised, but like, I don't know. I was taken aback by flabbergasted.
Okay, let's see. Let's find out. I haven't seen this yet, so let's find out.
Jewish Semitic idea of existence. This idea is we see it appear a couple times in the book of Job. The same expression in Hebrew, born of a woman, when Paul is when Job is speaking of just general humanity, human beings. We also see the same expression in the Dead Sea Scrolls to indicate human beings. So these are simple little things that appear in Paul's writings.
So this is a very incompetent argument that he's making right here, and this is the exact same argument that Tim O'Neill made. And when I mentioned the Tim O'Neill argument, and I have the article about that, where I really pwned the fuck out of Tim O'Neill on that. But there's also a section on this, what Kipp Davis just said, because Tim O'Neill put his foot in his mouth saying the same stupid fucking thing that's completely incompetently false. And so I take Tim O'Neill to task for that and show why he's wrong. So because Kipp Davis basically just exactly repeated amateur crank Tim O'Neill, I don't know why a PhD who should fucking know better would do that. That's a serious mistake. But that he did that, if you really want the refutation of what he just said, my refutation of Tim O'Neill is spot on, because they said exactly the same thing, and it's the exact same mistake.
Yeah, and it's my understanding, and I've actually verified this myself by looking at the Greek versions of the Septuagint and like Job and these other places that they talk about, that it's very specific to use genao in the Greek rather than genomai.
Yeah, every time. It's beget. It's always beget. It's not come to be. Right. Come to be is weird. Paul is weird. Paul made a weird choice. I think we'll get to it maybe after Kipp continues. We'll see, because I assume he's going to try and deny that this is an allegory. But when Paul goes on, he uses genao of people, like regular people. So Paul knows that he swapped the idiom out, right? So like he used genomai for Jesus, but when he talks about us, like ordinary people, or people in a story about ordinary people, he swaps out to genao. Like so Paul fucking knows this. Like he has made this substitution knowingly and on purpose, and we need to ask why. Why did he do that? And that's crucial. We'll get into that more, I think. Let's see what Kipp Davis.
Well, I hate to burst your bubble. He does not mention the allegory part or the allegory argument or anything like that. The only substantial argument that he really makes, as far as like Paul stuff goes, is concerning the cosmic sperm bank, or just, being literally made out of David's sperm and all this other stuff. That's the only kind of in-depth counter argument that he really.
His entire argument is mocking the Jewish God. Okay. Great. Super scholarly argumentation there. All right. Are you serious? Like, he doesn't even mention the fact that Paul literally says, like, a few lines later, that he's talking about an allegory?
No. I mean, he just takes it straight, like, oh, he says born of a woman here. And the translation of this, how it's represented in the Gospels, or not the Gospels, but in our current text, matches translation of older texts. And it's the same phrase. And like, it's just, it's kind of weird.
Yeah.
And the takeaway from that of these, for most scholars and for most historians, is the most natural way to understand these expressions are that they are with reference to Jesus' human existence, Jesus as a human being.
And that's it. Like, that's all he says. Just that the most natural, way to read it is that Jesus was a human being.
Yeah.
And he doesn't.
Okay, so King James Bible, Galatians 4:4, made of a woman. Let's see what other ones. So that's the King James said made of a woman. Let's see, born of a woman is the most common translation. The Douay-Rheims is made of a woman. That's the Latin, or the Catholic English. That's the Catholic competitor to the King James. It says made of a woman. There are others. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Okay. So I'm just looking really quick. Come of a woman, which is the literal standard version. I'm just looking through the list of translations. So come of a woman is also Young's literal translation. Anyway, so yeah, there are translations that admit that the phrase is not standard, that it's actually weird. So that's not true that everybody admits that what they're saying. The other thing is I'm concerned about this in terms of, I can't remember, and maybe I'm wrong. I don't know if Kipp Davis has ever discussed this passage before, or my argument. Is it that he has not, because he's not read my study, he hasn't read the study he's talking about, and therefore is completely unqualified to have a comment on the study that he's never read? Is it that he's not read it and therefore he doesn't know what my argument is for this passage, or what the evidence is for it? Or is he literally concealing it from the public? Is he literally just posing as if there is no rebuttal to what he just said?
Yeah, I mean, so in this particular interview, he doesn't give any kind of indication that you have rebuttals for this, or that there are rebuttals made by other people.
Yeah, right.
He doesn't like inform anybody about those possible things.
Yeah.
He only talks about a couple of arguments, and he does say that he finds that there are problems with mythicism, but he's usually like really vague about these problems and not so specific.
Yeah, for him to not even address the argument or know what it is while attempting to address an argument that he doesn't know anything about, is very unprofessional, and should not be lauded. This is not how he should be behaving, basically. If he wants to take on this argument, he needs to actually read it. He has to actually know what it's about, and he needs to correctly inform the audience what the argument is, and then voice why he doesn't buy the argument, right? Like, that would be a proper, honest, professional way to handle this argument. And so that's why I'm really astonished that he's done this very irresponsible thing here. I shouldn't be surprised, because he does this a lot. But I always have like this charitable, like positive assumption about people, and then they keep doing shitty, irresponsible, unprofessional things. And Kipp Davis does that over and over and over again, and I really shouldn't be surprised by it anymore. But it really is. This is irresponsible and unprofessional, and he should not be doing this. This is not how a scholar should be comporting themselves when dealing with serious scholarly arguments like this.
Yeah. And for anybody that's interested to see like the full video, because the full video is about 2.5 hours long. But I do have it linked in the description if you want to go and check it out and see like if I've missed something, because I'm the one that had to go through and figure out what's the important bits here that make the case, while removing any superfluous or unnecessary things, because Kipp tends to go off a little bit.
Well, we're coming up on 2 hours ourselves, so
yeah. No, I totally agree, and that's why I cut these down into smaller, manageable bits for people. So this is my last section, and I've called it argument from original context. Now, this is concerning the wisdom of Solomon, and it's basically Kipp is trying to, I guess, do a reductio ad absurdum on like what you say about the wisdom of Solomon in OHJ, which I don't know if he's read the section or how you use it.
Well, he claims to have read it, but he never correctly describes what the argument is. So
right.
Let's see what happens.
The way that these Jewish texts are presented is very frequently extremely problematic. And I'll give an example here from the Wisdom of Solomon, which I believe is a second or first century BCE Jewish text within early Judaism. And this traces way back into the ancient Israelite religion. This idea of the sons of God traces back to a thought of these are divine beings. They're originally thought of as actual gods. By the time this text was written, it's probable that the writer of this text thought of these as angels. Why is their lot among the saints? This is the NRSV says saints here. These are the Hagiah, or the holy ones, which again are indicative of these divine beings. Carrier will focus in on these points here in where is it, in verses 15 and 16. The righteous will live forever. Their reward is with the Lord. The Most High will take care of them. They will receive a glorious crown and a beautiful diadem from the hand of the Lord. So he explains this on the basis that it's possible within Judaism to understand that this could potentially refer to a single celestial figure, a son of God who suffered and who was crowned as the king of the universe. So
does he just not know the difference between singular and plural nouns in Greek?
I assume that's got to be it. Yeah, but you Jews did weird things with their text, so they could totally just extrapolate from plural expressions to apply to an individual. So it's in my opinion, it's a bad argument. So this passage.
So Rick, do you know about the singular and plural shit in Greek?
Yeah, right. So this is an example where Kipp Davis is just making shit up. He's not referring to or consulting any of the scholarship on this Wisdom of Solomon passage. So all of the actual scholarship, the peer-reviewed scholarship on the passages I'm talking about, they all acknowledge that some versions will put the plural in some parts of what I'm talking about, but not all versions do. And that's kind of an important thing. Moreover, the passages I cite are not all in the plural. So that's another thing that's wrong with this. So Kipp Davis has hugely garbled the facts and completely misrepresented the scholarship on this passage, and thus misrepresented what I'm talking about. Moreover, he at least, I want to give him credit that he at least admitted that my argument is solely about possibility, not fact. So I never said that this is how Jews before Christians were reading the Wisdom of Solomon. All I said was that this is how one way that they could have interpreted this. And again, this is one of the things where I feel like I'm being gaslighted when people like Kipp Davis say things like this. And I'm like, I've read a shit ton of fucking scholarship on this, and that is not in agreement with what I've read. And so, like, did I misread stuff? And so I go back and check. And I think I do have somewhere on my blog, I can't remember exactly where I do this Wisdom of Solomon stuff and the scholarship on it, and show that what Kipp Davis is saying is just uninformed about what actual scholars say about this passage. They don't say what he's saying about this passage. They actually agree that the Wisdom of Solomon, these passages I'm talking about, are actually interpretations of Isaiah 52 and 53. That in fact, that Wisdom of Solomon is actually riffing on the singular hero of those passages to create this. And then other interpreters transform some of the material into the plural, but not all the versions are in that way. So if you actually want to understand the Wisdom of Solomon, you have to look at the scholarship and the variety of interpretations and translations of the text and versions of the text. So Davis is just glossing over the entire reality of how scholarship handles these passages. So it's kind of useless to people. But the fact, I think it's worth pointing out that, like, I do say that's maybe, could easily have been, etc. This is all about plausibility and possibility. I never argue for the thing. And so at least he admits that. He hasn't done in the past. He's actually erroneously claimed that I made like factual statements about this, rather than what are called, God damn it, what's the word? modal arguments about this. And I've taken him to task for this error of confusing modal arguments with factual arguments. And it looks like he learned his lesson. Maybe he either read or someone chastised him who did read my article, correcting him on the error. Because at this point in this version, he admits that it's a modal argument and not a fact argument. So that's at least the case. But yeah, is it implausible for a Messianic Jew who's doing a Peser reading of these texts to read this in this way? Absolutely. Do a lot of scholars who've commented and written on these passages in the Wisdom of Solomon agree that that is possible? Absolutely. And I've cited some of them in some of my more recent work, so on my blog. So he's just not checking. He's not doing the research. He's not checking the literature. He's not admitting that there are scholars who actually agree with me in reading the modal argument regarding reading this. And that's just frustrating. Like, why fucking do that? Why not just do it competently, check the literature, and then inform the public? Like do your job. Is his job. Literally, his job should be informing the public as to what scholars say on this. And that doesn't mean cherry picking scholars who agree with him. It means admitting that there are scholars who say different things about this and talking about the different things. And then at least he's informed them. And then he himself can argue like, well, I agree with these scholars and not the ones that Richard agrees with. Well, that would at least be a competent position, because then he's at least informing the public that there's an actual ongoing debate about how to interpret these passages and how ancient, messianists interpreted these passages. That would at least be honest and would inform the public, and then they can make their own judgment based on whatever argument, like the logic of whatever argument Kipp Davis makes and whatever logic of whatever argument I make. They can make their own judgment from it. That would be a responsible, professional way to handle this kind of debate. But Davis seems uninterested in doing any of the things that a responsible scholar would do when dealing with these kinds of passages.
Yeah, and it kind of, I got the feeling, at least listening to this portion, that he was using the fact that you're making, these possible and likely kind of arguments as being a negative. Like,
right.
Of course, his arguments are all like, oh, it's perfectly clear that Paul was meaning human descent. Like, this is definitively proved.
Right. That's also true. It's because, as we've established before, when I did the critiques of his videos earlier on my blog, where he clearly rage skimmed the one chapter he read and didn't read the introductory section, which explains that some of the arguments are modal and some are not, and why that's relevant and how that works into my argument and so on. So he's not making any effort to understand how I'm using this material. He's making these wild, weird assumptions about how I'm using this material. Like he kept referring to celestial. I never said anything about celestial in this context. Like, why does he keep thinking that I used Wisdom of Solomon to argue for a celestial Messiah? I don't. Never fucking did that. But he has in his mind that I did, right? Like he's just, because he's not, and he doesn't know what the sections, what the chapters, like that we're talking about, chapters 4 and 5 of On the Historicity of Jesus. He has no conception of what those chapters are doing. Like he seems to think, for some reason, even though the chapters explicitly tell him not to think this, he somehow seems to think that those chapters are evidence against the historicity of Jesus, and they're fucking not. That's not the role. The role is background evidence, right? Is in terms of what's true, but also in terms of what's plausible, right? Like what is plausible in context is relevant when you're assessing the probability of something later on. So it matters. It matters that this is plausible, even if you admit that it's not established as factual or true or whatever. If you are willing to admit that it's plausible, that is absolutely relevant to any of your future estimates of probability that hinge on what is plausible and what is not. And so that's why this background evidence matters. And that's why some of the background knowledge is about what's plausible and not about what's true. And if you don't fucking understand that, you clearly did not read the study. You don't understand the argumentation of the study. You don't know what the fuck you're talking about. And that's what Kipp Davis keeps doing. He never studies. He never researches. He never checks these things. He never does any effort to understand what the argument actually is.
Yeah, I was rather surprised by him taking on Wisdom of Solomon here and using it in the way that he did, because later on, and I do have a clip of this in my hypocrisy section, they make it very clear that the original context of some reference or whatnot is important, but that as historians, or for them historians, it's up to them to track how it is interpreted and used later on, like by other people that are interpreting it. And it's just kind of like, I feel like this is rather weird, because you just chastise somebody for doing exactly that, but then you're saying this is what we do.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I can't comment on that because I didn't see it. So.
Right. Which if we got time, I can pull up the hypocrisy section, but there's a little bit more in this section right here.
This Peser, like all the Pesherim, is providing reflection on what has happened in history, but through the lens of what was said centuries earlier by the prophets. The point I'm trying to get at here, and the point I'm trying to make through attempting to correctly contextualize these texts, is that, like, these, when early Jews were reading their texts and looking intently for deeper meanings on what they said, almost always, in fact, I think it might be always, this had to do with what was happening to them in the moment.
Which makes sense,
right? This is a way of history writing, in a sense. They are interpreting their history through going back and looking at these very old ancient texts to see what they had to say about what would happen. Basically, like that's the point, right? Like these are very much about history, and when you understand them as such, like when you understand them as explorations of history, it becomes much more difficult to hold on to this idea that they're just inventing stuff out of whole cloth, out of reading the text of scripture, because we don't see that, like for the early Jews, this is just not how they used these texts. It's just not.
I'm not sure I understand what he's saying there.
Well, yeah, so he's talking about the use of Pesherim, and
yeah,
he thinks that you have a skewed view of Peshers and how they're created and how they were used by the Jews. And I've encountered this particular type of thinking with other people like Bart Ehrman and some of his students. But basically that the Peshers were created to understand things that recently happened to the Jews, and that you're suggesting that they're just pulling shit out of their ass and making stuff up that has no relation to anything that happened in their history.
Yeah, I don't. So he started by saying that they are rereading scriptures that were about events of the past as relating to events of their present, right?
Right.
And then he ended by denying that. So that's why I don't understand what he's actually saying here, because he contradicted himself within like 2 minutes. And so I don't know. So what I did with this, because again, he's fucking gaslighting us. So what I did is, and I felt gaslighted. It's like, I read the scholarship on this. I'm sure I'm right. So I went fucking back and I looked up a bunch of serious fucking experts on the Pesherim. Even mainstream textbooks. Timothy Lim, for example, wrote a mainstream textbook on how to read the Pesherim. I checked these and I got fucking quotes. I pulled quotes where they fucking say this, is that the Pesherim are always reading the scriptures as not as referring to the things they originally referred to, but as referring to things in the present or near future. So he's wrong in saying that they were only talking about things that recently happened. No, they're also including things that they think might soon happen, because that's literally what they're doing this for, is that they want to see what God's hidden message is so they can predict what's about to happen. So they're very concerned to find hidden messages from God about future events, like soon future events, but future events, not past, not recent past events. Recent past events might be relevant, like it might be part of the story, but their main goal is to get the future. They want to get the future interpretation out of it, not just the recent past. But either way, whichever one is, they're not using these passages with their original meaning. So whoever wrote the Wisdom of Solomon, it doesn't matter what they originally meant, what their original intention was, it's irrelevant, 100% irrelevant. When the Pesher logic comes to someone who's actually using and reading Wisdom of Solomon, they're already thinking that, okay, it doesn't fucking matter what the original author thought they meant or whatever. This is a secret hidden message from God that refers to my time, and not my time, not just like recent past, but also soon to come future. So all of the original meaning, that's all bullshit. I'm extracting a secret hidden meaning from God about what's going on now. That's Pesher logic. And I've quoted, and when I did the, I don't know if I did it in one of my articles about Kipp Davis when he said this bullshit. I quote like serious fucking Dead Sea Scroll scholars who are Pesherim experts, literally saying this. Like they're fucking. What I'm saying is the mainstream view of actual Dead Sea Scroll scholars. If Kipp Davis is saying or implying anything else, he's fucking lying. And I know he's lying because he's an expert in this field. He's worked with these people. He knows the truth. There's no way that he's just incompetently getting it wrong. So if he's saying something other than what I'm saying, he's a liar. And so that's just it. And if you don't believe me, you can follow the quotes and read the scholars that I've cited on the Pesherim. They're saying exactly the same thing I'm saying. I'm not saying anything weird or different than what those experts are saying.
Yeah. And it seems like he's fine with the Pesherim logic as long as it, helps him in his argument.
Yeah, I do see that there's a failure to generalize. So like, assuming that he didn't contradict himself there and he's just really shitty at explaining himself, assuming he actually meant the correct thing, which is that the Pesherim are reinterpreting old scriptures to relate to current events. Let's assume that he maintains that position, which is the correct position. Once you grant that that's the case, then you have to generalize it. So if the Dead Sea Scroll scholars are doing this, then everybody else who's doing Pesher is doing it, including the first Christians, right? So you can't say that only like the guy who wrote the Pesher of Habakkuk, only him, no other fucking person is reading it any other way. It's just him. All of Judaism agrees with him. No, that's false. The same logic that drives the specific Peshers that we have, that logic would drive other people in other decades, in other centuries, to do the exact same thing, but in their own way and updating it to their own time. So if you grant that Pesher logic does this for the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have to grant that it did it 100 years later and that they were doing the same thing, which means that they were updating, they were moving the meanings up 100 years to more recent events. So you have to look at it from that way. And that's exactly my point, is that once you grant that this is the case and then you move 100 years into the future, you're at the dawn of Christianity. They're looking at the text, they're doing the same thing. But of course, they can't refer to these texts as 100 years old anymore. They've got to think these texts refer to their current time. So they're going to reinterpret the texts to their current time. They're going to do the same thing. So once you grant that Pesher logic works a certain way, you have to grant that it works that way in every decade that it was ever applied by anybody, right? So you can't do this sort of weird concrete thinking that only there's only one moment in history when Pesher logic worked and no one else used it at any other time. No, that's not the case. We have abundant evidence that that's not the case. So anyway, if that's his argument, it's again a dumb argument, and I hope that's not what he meant to argue. But otherwise, I really couldn't understand what his argument was, because he seemed to contradict each other mid-sentence, and I don't really get that.
Yeah, well, I mean, they do this a good bit, and in this particular section right here, they were talking about a specific Pesherim interpretation that they were reading from another rabbi, and then it was just a way to explain how Pesherim worked, because he thought that you were just totally fucking up how Pesherim were doing, but how Pesherim were being created. But he did admit that there is a group of scholars that have mistakenly called stuff Pesherim. So there's multiple scholars that have mistakenly done this.
It can't be any of the people I quoted or cited. So they're literally like some of the top scholars on this subject, like full on. So no. But the thing is, I've never heard Kipp Davis ever give an example of what you're talking about, right? Like, so he says, I'm misinterpreting Pesherim. Well, give me an example. Where do I do this? Where? Right? Like, what are you talking about? Like, he doesn't give an example.
Right. Well, I think in this particular section, he's talking about like the wisdom of Solomon, being like a Pesher, and he doesn't mention really any other things that you.
But he doesn't. But that's the thing, is he doesn't. He only talked about the plural. He's bugged by the plural in some versions of it, in some verses of it. That's the only argument he gave. Like, he didn't give any argument like, oh well, if you applied Pesher logic to Wisdom of Solomon, you would get different results. He didn't argue that. Like, he didn't use that as an example. So, and he doesn't use any other examples either, right? So it's he never connects premise to conclusion. So there's this huge gap in logic between every statement he ever makes, and that's really frustrating. So it's really hard to evaluate even what he's trying to argue.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, in the live stream, he doesn't give any kind of indication that there are plural and singular versions of that text. So it seems like he doesn't even know about the alternative.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I find that hard to believe, but I don't know. I'm not aware of the secret knowledge of what Kipp Davis is doing. But yeah, right. The passages I quote are not all in the plural in every version. That is not the case.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I'm just saying what he kind of gave the impression of during the stream. So I don't know what he actually knows either.
Yeah.
But in the stream, he never gave the impression of, oh, these exist in like plural and singular. And he never makes any kind of real coherent argument against it. He sort of presents it and then laughs it off as ridiculous,
Right.
kind of in a Bart Ehrman fashion,
which is
laughing
just
it off.
disinforming the public. It's a classic example of this. This is irresponsible and unprofessional.
Right. So we are going into like our final like little clip here. This is something extra I prepared just in case we were able to get through a lot of stuff pretty quickly. But if you guys want to ask us specific questions, more so for Carrier here, send in a super chat. Any level of super chat will do. Just send in a super chat and we'll answer your questions. We'll discuss it right here at the end. We do have a few there of questions to address. So if you have any specific ones, anything that you want to say, and you want us to respond on, please send in a super chat. But we are going into this last little section here. And again, I do have Richard Carrier's links down below in the description, as well as a link to the original live stream if you want to go and see what was actually said without it being all sped up, or any of my edits. You want to see if I disingenuously like represented Kipp here. I did my best to string together coherent like lines of thought, but it was a little difficult for me. But anyways, so going into this last one is I guess kind of something that I've heard, and I mean, I know the rebuttal to it, but this is the first time that I've heard it come up in context of Kipp Davis. So
Okay.
I thought that I'd let you respond to it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's Sharon.
The thing is, or one of the things that I was thinking about earlier when we said that this was all, or that the argument is that maybe this is all just based on a mythical character, like happens in a lot of religious traditions. But the big difference is that generally when that happens, you set the historical narrative so distantly in the past that it's hard to check on. You don't send it. You don't set it like 60 years ago, right? That seems a little
Yeah.
What are your thoughts initially there?
I have a whole section on this on the historicity of Jesus. It's chapter 8.1, where I go into this idea of chronology, like where it is. So he's basing it on the assumption that the reason certain myths are dated the way they are is that it had to be ancient. That isn't what the evidence suggests. The evidence suggests that things are dated the way they needed to be dated. So, for example, the story of Romulus, which by definition is the story of the founding of Rome, has to be dated at the believed date of the founding of Rome, right? So Romulus is put in the 8th century BC, not because they had to put him in a distant past. They put him in the 8th century BC because that's when they believed Rome was founded, right? So the logic of the myth dictates where they're put. And because of a lot of Greek mythology centered around the Trojan War, a lot of gods got historicized in the timeline of the Trojan War, because that's where you thought that had to be the time of heroes. It was the 12th century BC. Therefore, that's when they all were. And it's not because you had to put them anciently. It's because that's where they belonged, right? And so when you get to the origins of Christianity, when do you put the myth of that? You have to put it at the origin of the religion, because they're saying, like, if you look at Paul's letters and stuff, Jesus has just recently died and risen from the dead. He's just announced the beginning of the general resurrection. The end times have begun, etc. So you cannot put Jesus back like 200 BC or whatever, because you need the religion to have started when you need it to have started. So like if the story is that he started under Pilate in that period, if it was in the 30s, if you date Paul's letters to the 50s, the religion being the visions and so far began in the 30s, you have to put it in the 30s. You just have to, right? But we know that there are some Christians who didn't. They moved it to the time of Gennaeus. They put it 100 years earlier. For whatever reason, they had some sort of logic. Whatever the logic was, they decided that it needed to be then. Now, we actually have a reference to this in Epiphanius. So there's kind of like this weird digression in Epiphanius. It seems like it's disconnected, like there's some material that's been missing. Like he doesn't explain why he's going into this digression, but he puts it into his discussion of the Nazorians, which is the original Torah observant Christians. And in his time, he regards them as a heresy. But he goes into this discussion in under their heading. So it's clearly he's describing some belief they had. And we have confirmation of this from the Talmud, that the reason Jesus had to be placed in 75 BC is because prophecy predicted that the Messiah would come when the last true king died or ceased to hold the throne, so that Jesus had to come with what they believed would be the last true king. And there was a lot of dispute about the legitimacy of the Herods and the ones who came after Jannaeus. So certain Christians, certainly in the Eastern Empire, outside of the Roman Empire, on the eastern side, they were no longer tied to the Roman chronology because the Roman Empire is not relevant to them. So they put it appears, according to the Talmud, they put it under Jannaeus. And so they decided there's some sort of scriptural reason why they thought they had to do that. So it wasn't because they needed to push it back in time. It was just because that's when the myth had to be for them. Whereas in the Roman Empire, the myth had to be under Pilate in order to fit the timeline for the origin of the religion that they believed in the Roman Empire. So that's how it's decided. So the question really is not why they did that. The question is, did they have to set it in an ancient time? Right? So usually the more logical version of this argument is that they couldn't put it so early. Right, like if you're writing if Mark's writing in the 70s AD, that it would be impossible for him to completely make up a man only 40 years after the fact. And so I address that by showing that that's false, that we have lots of examples of completely fabricated people and myths within a 40-year timeline. It's very common, especially in the conditions, even in conditions better than the conditions from the ancient Roman world, but even in the Roman conditions. So you can't argue that they couldn't do it. So that leaves what the version I said, what Kipp sort of presented, which is the idea that somehow they magically needed to put it into the past as if for some cultural reason. Like there's no like necessity to it, that there's some sort of like they would never countenance the idea that it could have been only 40 years ago. There's no evidence of that. That is not how that's not how myths got dated. They were not dated based on the need to push it far back. They were dated based on whatever the myth needed the origin to be. So when you look at it that way, then there's no objection left to why Mark would place it in the 30s AD. It's not barred by impossibility. It's actually necessitated by Mark's entire story, like his entire belief about the origins of the religion. He has to put it in the 30s AD. That's just logically required by it, and especially if you look at the later Christian mathematics from Daniel. So if you look at like Julius Africanus, he's doing the math showing that Daniel predicted that it had to be the 30s. Now we don't accept this as a historically valid way to determine when Jesus existed, but it is how Christians were doing it, right? So this is the kind of scriptural math they're doing. They're figuring, when did Daniel say it had to be? Daniel cannot have lied because he's a prophet inspired by God. Therefore, if we believe Daniel said it's the 30s AD, then it's fucking the 30s AD, and that's it, right? So that's the logic. That's how people like Mark and stuff came to these conclusions. And so it has nothing to do with the need to push it back. So I think Kipp Davis is just, again, he doesn't know that I've discussed this. I've addressed this extensively in the study. He's supposed to be knowledgeable about that if he's going to talk about it, but he doesn't give a shit what the study says that he's actually responding to because he's irresponsible and unprofessional. But if he had actually done the work and actually looked at the study that he's supposed to be talking about, then he would know everything I just said. And then maybe he'd have a better argument against it rather than this completely ignoramus buffoon bullshit argument.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, there were a few groups of Jews coming up in the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE that had different like interpretations of Daniel's timeline, and it ranged from a large amount of time. Which I guess going back to a previous section, it seems to me like if we were just to say, oh yeah, the Jews never created Pesherim to predict near future events, and they only were creating these things to explain stuff that had just happened to them, like couldn't it be a plausible explanation that, oh, we predicted the Messiah would come here, nothing happened, how do we understand this? Let's look at the scriptures. Like, is that not like a plausible like alternative to Jesus literally coming and dying on the cross?
I just really have this hard time believing that Kipp Davis actually meant to say that. So
no. That's not what he said. This is my own sort of idea.
Yeah. Because like take for example the Melchizedek scroll, right, which is a Peser. The Melchizedek scroll talks about the celestial Melchizedek coming with armies of angels and defeating defeating Satan, and there's this massive battle and stuff. There's no fucking way they believe that just recently happened. That's a past event. Oh, yeah, last weekend, like the angels came down and the world ended. Meanwhile, no, like that. I fucking hope that that's not what Kipp Davis meant to say. No, obviously, Melchizedek scroll is a Peser. Obviously, it's about near future events. It's about trying to predict when Melchizedek would come. And it might occasionally refer to recently past events in an effort to understand the timeline leading to future events. That's true. But then, then it's the question of when do they mean which, but there's certainly, you can never say that they're not trying to predict the future from the scriptures. That's, that is literally the most incompetent and ridiculous thing that I could ever believe Kipp Davis would say about the Pesherim. And so that's why I have to believe that that's not what he meant, that we must misunderstand him. He must have just fucked up what he said and been confusing, as often is the case. So I have to grant that prior probability. It's a reasonable possibility that he's just bad at explaining himself.
Okay. We do have a little bit more on this, distant past sort of section. This is actually Kipp is going to be, I guess, piling on top of what Dapper introduced.
I think that could potentially be problematic, right? Like it's I think you're right. Well, a more or less clearly related case to this is basically what happens with the invention of Moses by the ancient Israelites. The precursors to the Jews had this idea that there was this figure who led Hebrews out of Egypt, Hebrew slaves out of Egypt, and into the land of Canaan. There's all sorts of historical problems with the biblical story, the way the biblical story has been told about this. But it, and these are very late. Like most of this stuff is not written down until literally hundreds of years after an event like the Exodus. But even then, I will say that there is some possibility that there could have been a person of some sort who led a slave revolt, or who led a group of slaves out of Egypt at some point in time into the land of Canaan.
So it's possible, yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
Anything's possible, right? It's possible there was a volcano, and the Exodus is just a confused accounting of a volcano that occurred. That's been seriously proposed. Yeah, I have no respect for these kinds of arguments. That it's possible. Yeah, sure. We're not talking about what's possible. We're talking about what's probable and what the evidence can establish. And the evidence can't establish a historical Moses. And that's it. That's the end of conversation on that.
Yeah, he wasn't actually making an argument for a historical Moses. He was just like, well, like there's this one section in I think, was it Joshua? He mentions another Old Testament book where they refer to Moses, but they don't give him like a specific name and everything like that. And so like there's this slim chance that there was a historical person, and so we have to remain open to that. But that doesn't mean that it it actually happened.
Yeah, right. Which I do with Jesus too, which makes that whole argument a complete waste of time for everybody, right? I was like, I totally acknowledge that there's a historical Jesus. I even give it a respectable probability. So yeah, I think like the evidence for Moses is worse than for Jesus, but yeah, absolutely, right. Like so, that's not even the argument that's being advanced. Like so, they're arguing against a ghost. No one argues the position that they're arguing against. So, I just find it a waste of time. It's kind of silly for them to do that.
Yeah, I agree. The only other section that I had exported for us to sort of talk about is this one discussion on the brother of the Lord. Basically, they see it as a very clear indication that Jesus existed, because you can't have a brother if you didn't exist, which or problems with that kind of logical
Sure.
or illogical thinking.
Do they address the rebuttal, or do
No.
they not even mention it? So
No,
we don't even need to see the clip then. That's I don't see the point.
Yeah.
If they're not even going to talk about why that's a bad argument, why even bother? Like they're wasting our fucking time, right? It's like
Mhm.
they're just saying something that's been refuted, not even acknowledging that it's been refuted, presenting no rebuttal to the refutation, and they're further completely disinforming the audience. Like again, this is irresponsible and unprofessional. So yeah, this that shit really bugs me. But people who want to know about this, like I obviously have a whole section on it on the historicity of Jesus. I have a whole chapter on it in Jesus from Outer Space for people who want the fun, short, colloquial version of things. But it goes into that. But the short of it is that Paul explicitly says that all baptized Christians are the brothers of the Lord. And he never, which means that he would have to distinguish between fictive brothers of the Lord and biological brothers of the Lord if he ever meant to refer to biological brothers of the Lord. So the fact that he doesn't even know that there's a difference, that there is two different brothers of the Lord that he needs to tell us about, when he refers to the brothers of the Lord, he just assumes there's only one known category. And the only category that he tells us he knows about is the fictive category. And that ends that argument. Like it's done. You can't use any of the quotations. There's only two of when Paul talks about brothers of the Lord, because there's no indication as to which kind he means. And when Paul himself talks about what he understands brothers of the Lord to mean, he only knows of the fictive kind. He never talks about biological kin of Jesus. And that's it. Like the evidence is gone. You can't use it. And so you have to really, that's the argument you have to respond to. And I have obviously interacted with people that come with knee-jerk armchair reactions because it can't be true. It's like Luke Skywalker clinging to the thing. It's impossible. And so they come up with some bullshit. Like they'll spin some bullshit. And I say, you know what? I thought of that. I have a refutation of it. It's in the fucking study. So all the bullshit, armchair, fake, stupid arguments that people come up with to try and argue against what I just argued just now, I thought of it. I thought of it. I'm sorry. I thought of it before you did. It's covered. It's in the study. Read the fucking study.
Yeah, so there in the Brother of the Lord section, Daniel Galata actually throws in I guess not really a counter argument, but a question that they think throws a wrench into it.
Right.
But I feel like it's like, even with my I'll say limited knowledge in that I'm not an expert, I feel like I know what the answer is to this. But Galata asked, James having such authority and being singled out in 1 Corinthians 15:7 by Paul makes the best sense if he was simply Jesus's brother. If he was just another Christian brother, why not include him in verse 6?
Why not say he's the brother of the Lord there? Right? It doesn't say it, right? So they're fabricating evidence that doesn't exist based on their assumptions, right? Like, so the question is why would James get a special vision? Well, there could be lots of reasons why James would get a special. We don't even have a reason why the brothers of the Lord would get a special vision later than the other apostles. Like, we don't have any story that accounts for that. So there's they have no explanation for it either. They're just making shit up, right? Like making shit up is not a good argument for something. We don't know. Paul does not say that James was the brother of the Lord. He doesn't say he was the brother of Jesus. He doesn't say any of that. And so he doesn't tell us why James got a later one. Now, I personally think that line is an interpolation. I think that's a scribe later added that. I don't think Paul wrote it. But I never use that as an argument because I can't prove it, right? I have no specific evidence that that's the case. So I operate on the assumption that Paul wrote that line. But if Paul wrote that line, he doesn't tell us who this James was. He doesn't tell us why he got a late vision. He doesn't even say that James is different from the 12, right? Because it could be a second vision, like another vision to James. There was some sort of special important vision. We don't know because Paul doesn't tell us. And that's another thing that I find the problem with this methodology of the historicists is that they have all these huge towers of assumptions, all these assumptions. And they'll never admit that there's most things we don't fucking know. We don't know why Paul had that extra line about James. We don't know who that James is. Just admit it. We don't fucking know. And that's it, right? Like why is that so hard? Why can you just say Paul doesn't say? We don't know. End of story.
Right.
Why do we have to stack a bunch of bullshit assumptions that we have no evidence for to reinterpret the passage? We there's no reason for that. And so this gets back to the point we pointed out earlier regarding the sperm bank stuff, right? Because that's the kind of argument they throw at me. Is that why do you need the stacks of assumptions? I'm not arguing from those assumptions at all. My argument is from the prophecy of Nathan, right? My argument is that he has to say that. And so the only thing that I have to do then is show that it's plausible that there are ways to interpret it that would be consistent with Nathan and a non-existent Jesus. So all I'm doing is showing how that would work. I'm not saying that therefore it's true. Mm-hmm. That's not how the argument works, right? So they're the ones who are saying that it's true. It's true. We know that it's true that James is the brother of Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15:7. They're the ones who are making shit up, right? They're just spinning shit. There's no evidence to back what they're saying. And they're resting their entire basis for the historicity of Jesus on these bullshit assumptions that have no evidential basis. They're the ones doing that. And all I'm doing is pointing that out, right? So that's the thing, is that it's funny when they try to make the argument against me that I'm making shit up. I am not. That is not the logic of how I'm arguing and proceeding. That is how historicists argue. That's not. I am actually saying that is a stupid way to argue, and we shouldn't be doing that. Right. And anyway, so it's important to note the difference between those two, because a lot of people conflate them. They think I'm doing the same thing, but I'm actually doing a very different thing when I talk about things like the sperm bank and stuff like that. I'm doing a importantly logically different thing than what you just quoted them doing with the brother of Jesus.
Right. Also on the brother of Jesus, I guess it was my understanding that Jesus, at least as far as maybe Paul's concerned, or the theology of Christianity in general, didn't actually achieve the title of Lord until after he resurrected. And so for me personally, combined with the actual Greek words that are used there, it definitely makes it seem like they're saying, oh, this person is a brother of this resurrected being. And
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. So I haven't used that argument myself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm undecided about its merit. My knee-jerk reaction is that it's a reverse masked man fallacy, right? So let's hypothesize that there really was a historical Jesus, and he really had a brother named James, and that's who Paul is referring to in Galatians 1 verse 19 or whatever it is. Assume all of those things. Would Paul have written brother of Jesus instead of brother of Lord? And so this is what gets to the logic of evidence. Like, what is probable for Paul to say in that situation? And I think by that point, because Paul believes Jesus is the Lord, he would never deny that he was the Lord, and he would never imply that he wasn't the Lord. Because Paul's saying that he's the Lord now, when he refers to like a biological brother of Jesus, he would say Lord, right? So I think that's not improbable. I think it's more probable that he would transpose the title because he believes that Jesus and the Lord are the same person. And if you know, you can look up the masked man fallacy, is this idea that I know who the masked man is, etc. Because he could be anybody. So that you can read the Wikipedia entry on it. The masked man fallacy would be the opposite of this, where you would say like Lord, but you don't mean Jesus. So anyway, the point being is that Paul in that passage is not talking about history. He's talking about the present, and therefore he would use the present title of Jesus. So it'd be like saying the brother of the king, even though if someone had just become king recently, but they had been their brother long before that, right? Like you wouldn't say the brother of Joe, you would say the brother of the king. You see what I'm saying? Like, so I don't think that reasoning that you gave there is a good argument for it. But I am bothered by the fact, like you said, that Lord is a cultic title. And so when you're talking about brothers of the Lord, you are kind of in a sort of iffy area as to, are you talking about biology or are you talking about fiction? And Paul does give us the baseline for the fiction of that. And so the argument I just made works against Kipp Davis's position as much as it would work against yours, because for the same reasons. Because I think he would say like the word Lord is not used in the passage when Paul says that Jesus became the firstborn of many brethren. Well, that's a masked man fallacy to say that because Paul said Jesus was the firstborn of many brethren, therefore he can't have believed that the Lord was the firstborn of many brethren. Well, now you're saying that the Lord and Jesus are not the same person. And would Paul say that? No, he fucking wouldn't. So that is an invalid argument from Kipp Davis's perspective. So his argument's false too, for the same reason. That would be my take. That's like my immediate response to that kind of thing. But it's a thing that I do think about a lot, because it does bother me that the word Lord is used there, even though I can explain it.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I think I've mentioned that once before, but the way that I generally explain it is, comparing, this use of brother of the Lord to Paul's theology on the family of God, right, and how it obfuscates it. So my official position is we can't know what is actually being meant here. But I guess I haven't really used the whole Lord thing as like definitive, argument or anything like that. But it's good. It's good to know for in the future, like how that can actually,
right. I can devil's advocate for the historicist on that. Yeah, for sure.
Right. Well, that's going to be it for everything in that stream. I mean, there was like a list of like comparing mythicism to creationism, but that I mean, it was really just Kipp Davis going down the line and doing sort of a poisoning the well or almost a genetic fallacy kind of thing with it. But I don't know. Do you have any ideas about comparing mythicism to creationism?
Well, the evidence for evolution is really, really good. If we had the evidence for Jesus that we have for evolution, then yeah, they'd be right. But we don't, so they're wrong. That's the case. No, we don't have that kind of evidence. Even Kipp Davis, like you pointed out, notes that we don't have evidence that good. The evidence is all problematic. That's not the case for evolution. The evidence is not problem. I mean, there's some problems, but overall, no, it's not problematic. It's pretty decisive. Creationism is well refuted. Flat earthism and so on, this similar way. Holocaust denial, super refuted. No, the scale of evidence we have for those is not comparable to the scale, not even orders of magnitude, like many orders of magnitude less comparable to that. So like that's the thing, is the evidence for Jesus is shit compared to those. And so you can't really make that analogy. And I do think that's a definite sign of apologetics, that anyone who would make that argument is basically off the rails. They're no longer being an objective historian. They're just engaging in polemics and apologetics and not serious, responsible scholarship. Because it's just a bullshit argument, right? It's they're the same. No, they're not. They're not even in any way the same, in zero ways the same. So yeah. So anyway, yeah, that would annoy the hell out of me. But let's do some super chats. Do we have some?
No, yeah. That's where I was going to next. So we've got Rainbow Krampus, who says, could Clement's talk of witnessing and dying be an early form of the persecution complex we see from Acts? Or do you think he's talking real history?
It sounds like Rainbow Krampus might have read my recent article on this. So on my blog, I actually talked about this recently. What does Clement mean when he talks about these persecution events? But to answer the specific question, so there's a lot of assumptions here. What is persecution complex, etc. I do think that by the time of Clement, and I think already you see this in Paul, although Paul never refers to people dying, interestingly enough, but he never refers to killing anyone when he's a persecutor, for example, and he never talks about anyone else dying for the faith. He talks about himself being like beaten and things like that, but so we're not really sure. But even Paul's talking about suffering, like being beaten, being arrested, and whatever for your faith. as proof of its truth. So that if you can stand by it and endure it, that is proof of your authority. It's proof that God talked to you. It's proof that the Spirit is in you, etc., and therefore validates the entire religion. And so with that mindset, when you get to Clement, and I do believe First Clement was written in the 60s AD, which is, there are several scholars who agree with me, but that's not the mainstream view. Most scholars buy the later legendary bullshit excuse that it was written in the 90s. But I think it's written in the 60s. I do think that even by that time, that the idea that Christians could get killed for their faith existed, and that killing was meant by the people killing them to change their mind about the religion, right? So it's a persuasion method. If you're a cult who wants to resist that persuasion method, you have to come up with an alternative narrative whereby death confirms the religion and therefore negates the "you should stop believing it" narrative that the killing was meant to cause. So basically, to negate the efforts and entire intentions of your abusers, you have to reinterpret what they're doing to support your entire mission. And that logic is what sustains all martyr movements throughout history, right? So like this is a standard. You can look at the history of religions, anthropology of religion, and stuff like this is universal. It happens all the time. So there's nothing unexpected about re-glorifying death for the faith. And I just think that if you're a persecuted group, you have to do that. You have to valorize and turn into heroes, aka martyrs, anybody who's killed for the faith. Otherwise, you're giving in to the whole point of the killing them, which is to pressure you into giving up your faith. So in order to sustain your faith, you have to come up with this new narrative. You have to rewrite the narrative of people being killed as glorious and heroic. And so that's what Clement is doing. And so his very flowery, indirect, pompous way of talking about persecution is very much in this vein of glorifying it in order to promote the religion and resist efforts to quash it by force. And so I do think that psychology is what's going on there. I hope that answers the question. I do think he's talking about real history. It's just a question of specifically what is he talking about. That's more disputable. What kinds of deaths, by whom, for what reason, which ones are deaths, etc. Like that's all disputable because of the way his language works. But I do think he does mean that Peter and Paul were killed for their beliefs for some reason, one way or another, by someone somewhere. Right. The details are more debatable. But I do think, yeah, he's seeing their deaths as a result of their faith and trying to reinterpret it in a heroic narrative, because they have to, basically.
I think that was a very comprehensive answer there. Peter Garone just sent us $5. Thank you so much there, Peter.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So that's great. A lot of people do that. That's super do that. Super chat, send some money in, even if you don't have a question. If you thought this was a useful live stream, for example, because then it like tells us how much interest there is in this kind of thing. So yeah, if you put your money where your beliefs and passions are, it's helpful for us. So absolutely do that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I always love having you on there, Rick. So
I
know that'll continue next year.
Right.
Next, we got the Mythic Life, who says, given the emphasis of adoption in the spirit over biological family in Paul in the Gospels, would it be very important to Paul if James was Jesus's biological brother?
Okay, so I know some backstory behind this question. I would like to call attention to the scholar who, I mean, he's an amateur, but he wrote a really astute article on this. I don't know if Mythic Life, if you've got the link, if you can throw it into the comments for people, but it came up in our discussion earlier before this. I don't want to, it's gonna take me a while to find it if I do, but I can't remember their name or the article. But anyway, they wrote this article where they were pointing out that the New Testament is full of denigration of biological kin. So the Gospel of Mark absolutely has Jesus just renounce biological family as irrelevant and saying that the only true family you have, the only family that matters, are your Christian kin. So your fictive kinship completely replaces biological kinship. And there's a lot of other passages that they didn't mention. So like let the dead bury their own dead. So that there's the guy talking about, I got to bury my parents or whatever. So he's, fuck them. They're just biological kin. They don't matter. They're irrelevant. The only thing that matters is your fictive kinship. Are you an heir to the kingdom? That's it. Are you in that family? If you're not in that family, you're fucked. No other families matter, right? And so that message echoes across the Gospels. And you see it in Paul too. He's talking about like biological family doesn't matter. And he even says, like, when he says like there's in Christ, there's like, or in the baptized or whatever, there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, etc., neither male nor female. He's saying that biology is fucking meaningless. It doesn't matter. What matters is, are you in the Christian family? That is it. That is the only thing that matters. And so there's a lot of evidence of this across the Bible. So the point being is that, like, would anyone give a shit about the biological brothers of Jesus, given this really extreme polemic against biological kinship being relevant to the future? And I think that's a good point. I don't think they would. I don't think they would value biological kinship at all. And I do know that there's a lot of scholars that are really hung up on this idea of dynasties, that somehow they super respected the family of Jesus because they're going to carry on the seed of David and all this bullshit. Now, I think that's anachronistic thinking. I think it's thinking by people who are thinking that Christianity is just like any other dynastic movement, and it was not. It never was. There's no biological dynasty ever in Christianity. The popes are not biologically related to each other. They're not. There's not like a descent. Like you have to biologically inherit the papacy. No, bishopric. No, there's no biological inheritance issue. It's all the fictive kinship concept. And so I think when you look at it that way, when you look at how the Christians conceive these things, the idea that the biological brothers of Jesus mattered would not have been a thing. And so I do think that's correct. I think it's a correct reading of the evidence. And so they would not be special. They would not have a special rank. And even when Paul talks about the ranks that people have in the church, the family of Jesus aren't on it. And that's interesting. So that tells you that it is not relevant. They're not seeing it as special. They're not seeing it as giving them some sort of authority at all. And if that's the case, then that reduces the probability that Paul's going to go out of his way to mention a biological brother of Jesus, because it doesn't matter. Like, why would he mention it? It's not relevant to their worldview.
But I mean, come on, Rick. There's that one thing that says brothers of the Lord, so you could basically look them up in a phone book.
Right. For people who are interested, I cover that in the chapter section on the historicity of Jesus on this. So yeah.
All right. So next up, we've got Amaranta Arcadia Castillo Gomez, sent in 50.
That's amazing.
I believe it's pesos, maybe. I'm not sure what the MX is, but thank you so much there, Amaranta. Appreciate
awesome.
you.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel M says, David says good night. I don't know if David is still up, but good night there, David. Hope you have a great weekend there, bud. And I'll see you later there, Daniel. And then we've got Reality Revolutions, who says, has Kipp ever retracted what he has said in any of his videos, or changed his position on anything, or said he has even read or watched Richard's responses and rebuttals? I believe that he's at least on one occasion said that he's read one of your blogs, but maybe he just rage skimmed it.
The first line, no, he has never retracted or corrected himself on anything whatsoever. Even when he's been decisively proved to be wrong, he's never corrected anything. Yeah, absolutely the case. Whether he's ever said he's read or watched my stuff, I don't know, because I don't follow Kipp around, so I don't really know everything he said. I don't follow his Twitter feed. I don't watch all of the videos he does on his own show or any other show. So like 99% of the things that Kipp Davis has said publicly, I don't even know what they are. So I can't comment on whether he's never said that. But I would have found out. Someone would have told me if he'd ever retracted anything or corrected anything. So I do know he's never done that.
Yeah. I don't expect him to. He seems to be pretty hard line, like, very anti, Richard Carrier at this point.
Right. Yeah. No, he does not seem interested at all in doing scholarship like a professional scholar. And when it comes to me, it's just all polemic, ignorance, armchair bullshit. And he's established that so many times now that's why I can say that. Normally I wouldn't just jump out and just say that's the case, but I've seen it, like, it's too many times now, so that, like, I know that's just his mainstream thing. That's just how he does it. His SOP. Yeah.
Yep. Paul Reap became a member. Thank you so much there, Paul. Appreciate you. Reality Revolutions also sent in another one saying, has Richard ever had any direct communication with Kipp before or after his vendetta with him?
No, not that I recall. I mean, unless there's something really minor and casual, but nothing substantive for sure. No. I only found out about him, I think, when he was criticizing my work, and then I checked him out and like looked up his stuff and got a sense of him, or at least I thought at the time. I realized my sense of him was wrong at the point. Like, I thought he was actually competent, but now I understand that that's not the case. But no, we had no personal, like, significant connection before that. He just, out of the blue, like, just started like ragging on me and calling me incompetent and publicly, and so I had to like respond. And that's literally the entirety of my relationship with Kipp Davis. Is that?
Well, so I remember having public tweets back and forth with Kipp, and he also was pretty heavily into my, I guess, beef with Neil, Gnostic Informant. And, he had a lot of things to say in that particular situation. And then I tried to contact him and get him to come onto my channel to explain some things to me, because it's like, well, I just don't, understand where you're coming from. And I'd love to have like a live stream where you explain it to me. And so he opted to have a more private conversation with me about it, which I was not impressed with. And then the vendetta, against you started, and he's not said one word to me or anything like that. So that's the progression of this entire shit show right here.
And that seems to be a replicated story time and again. So, right. Yeah.
All right. And then here's one from Ruined Roast who says, oh, egads, my historical Jesus is ruined. But what if I were to make up hypothetical sources and disguise them as historical evidence? Oh, delightfully speculative Ermine.
That's like a I want to say like a satirical or parodic summary of Raphael Lataster's peer-reviewed book. Questioning
I would agree.
Jesus.
I just got through that section in Lataster's questioning the history.
Well, that's right. You were telling me you were you're listening to her reading the entire book. Which is awesome.
Yeah. So I'm right now I'm at the second review that he's doing, and I can't remember. It's not Gather Cole.
Maurice Casey.
Maurice Casey. That's right.
Yeah. Those are his two. Cases. Those are his two thesis study subjects, is Bart Ehrman and Maurice Casey, because at the time those were the only books defending historicity that were out. Like, so there's still to this day has not been a peer-reviewed study defending historicity, like zero, which is shocking to me. I don't understand why anybody can't produce a monograph responding to Lataster and I. like give us your best shot. Like, give us your best peer-reviewed, defense of historicity that we can compare with ours, right? Like, anyway, no, all there were these pop market books that by Bart Ehrman and Maurice Casey, and those are the only two really by anyone who could be called an expert, a legit expert, and that's why Lataster had to do his study on them.
Yeah, I mean, as we always say in the mythicist meetings, it's this goddamn cabal out there that's preventing all this genuine scholarly work from being done. Oh man. All right. So we got a few new ones that have come in. Awesome. Margaret Del Velden says,
Margaret.
I always learn
Hello.
from
How's it going? Yeah. Awesome.
I always Always learn from these discussions. Thanks, John, and thanks, Richard. Thank
Yeah.
you so much there, Margaret. And then reading between the lines, that's the only
Thank
way I
you.
could read that name now. It says, okay, here you go. Just throwing money at us. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
Really do. And then Amaranta says, I'm Mexican, and as an anthropologist, I am enjoying all this discussion.
Fantastic. Yeah. Anthropologists really do need to be in this discussion, because I found that anthropological literature has been so useful.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of scholars in this field aren't reading it. Like they aren't coming at the explanations of the origins of Christianity or the development of the myths in Christianity. They aren't coming at it informed from the anthropological perspective. So I do think anthropology of religion is like more important than I think has been granted in the field. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to see a lot of work done on that, like combining anthropology and how Christianity began. Because I think that even as it exists now, that there's a lot of facts that a lot of people just sort of don't even consider, and they weren't things that I considered when I started my foray, into studying this topic.
Right. There's a lot of anthropological literature on revolution cults, which is dead on relevant to Christianity, to apocalyptic cults, and relating to visionary cults. So the role of hallucination and or dreaming and or pretending to do either is like super common. Like if you look at the ethnographic record, our denigration of hallucination is actually weird, which is why we're called weird, WEIRD. I don't know, have I mentioned this before, that Western educated, industrialized, and democratic, those cultures think that they're normal, and then they use themselves as the standard by which to evaluate what humans would do. But no, we're actually super fucking weird in the ethnographic record. If you look outside of the weird cultures, you see a much more common things that have more in common with the origins of Christianity and the original Christian movement than our cultures do. And this gets to the point I made earlier about anachronistically thinking about how, like, looking at how the ancients understood things. And if we want to understand Christianity, we have to understand it from their point of view. Their point of view is not our point of view. So everything that all our assumptions and stuff that are based on our weird culture are wrong if you're going to try and understand them. So you got to look at the ethnographic record, where you see the vast majority of cultures, or certainly the majority of cultures, look more like Christianity in terms of the way they think about things than us. And so the way they understand concepts, the way they understand things like fictive kinship, for example, the way we see adoption is very different from the way that a lot of other cultures see adoption and family and things. And that matters for understanding Christianity. And that's just one tiny piece of example of what I'm talking about. But yeah, I do think it's great to see an anthropologist following the conversation, because I think that it's good to see. We need more engagement by anthropologists.
Yeah, I think so too. And then finally, we've got Bridge, who just sent in 100 yen.
All right.
I believe that's yen. Thank you
that is the yen symbol. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much there, Bridge. Appreciate you for sending that in. Now, we do have one that I singled out, not a super chat, but I do think it's a pretty good question. Do Dr. Carrier or GE recommend or think any of Ehrman's books are good scholarship or worth a read?
Yeah, absolutely. All his peer-reviewed stuff. So even some of his pop market stuff, yes. So like Jesus Interrupted, that's a pop market book. It's not a peer-reviewed book. But if what you want to know is what are the most common positions held by the mainstream in scholarship, that book is spot on. You got to read that book. Not because the positions are necessarily correct, but simply because he's accurately describing what the beliefs and positions are. And so I think that is a really good and useful book. And I still recommend it as the standard introduction for what is mainstream New Testament studies saying. I always pair it with, for the Old Testament, The Bible Unearthed by Silberman and Finkelstein. And that's the best intro to where is mainstream biblical studies for the Old Testament. And so those two books are the two that I recommend. So yes, others of his popular market books I have problems with, like, positives and negatives. If you want to see an example, I have a review of his How Jesus Became God. I don't read all of his pop market stuff because I find it like a little too 101 and sometimes often inaccurate. But if you want to see like my take on like positives and negatives of a book in that category, look at my review of How Jesus Became God, and that's an example of it. But I can't think of a single example of a peer-reviewed monograph he's published that I think is bad. So I think, like, for example, he wrote a pop market book called Forged, but the peer-reviewed study is called Forgery and Counterforgery, and that is a master study. It doesn't mean I agree with everything he says in it. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is it's a really fucking good book, and I think it's like essential reading if you want to talk about forgery. How do we know things are forgeries? How do we respond to the apologetics that try to deny forgeries or deny they matter? So even like the idea, like, no one cared about forgery, right? That's an apologetic thing. Like, people could just claim to be Paul. That was totally accepted at the time. Totally false. And Bart Ehrman does the total destruction of that argument. It's very good. And orthodox corruption of scripture, I think, is really good and an excellent introduction to things people don't know about the fact. And so orthodox corruption is an example where Ehrman starts looking at manuscripts that are not even in critical apparatuses because they're copies of copies we already have. So you often hear apologists say that we have thousands, we have 100,000, maybe 500,000 manuscripts of the Bible. Almost all of those are copies of copies we already have, so they're useless. So we know where their source text, so we don't need them. But there's still a lot of meddling going on, right? So there's a lot you can learn if you go look at those texts. You see how fluid the text is, how readily errors could be made, how readily changes could be made. And so Ehrman's orthodox corruption of scripture is a good study of that. So anyway, answer to your question is, yeah, all this peer-reviewed stuff is spot on and good. Even if it's not always correct, it doesn't matter. Not every scholar, not even myself, is always correct. So, but it is definitely their must-read books. They're very good scholarship. And so, yeah, his peer-reviewed stuff, yeah. His pop market stuff I have issues with. The only one that I don't is Jesus Interrupted, simply because it's not claiming to prove a position other than to just survey what everybody thinks. And I think, you can't go wrong if you get that right, basically, even if everything is wrong. That's not the point. But anyway, yeah, that's my best response to that.
Okay. Yeah, I believe I have all of the peer-reviewed stuff that he's done, and I want to say that I used Forgery, Counterforgery when I was looking to educate myself on, like, why the pastoral epistles aren't
Right.
written
Mhm.
by Paul.
Yeah, it's an invaluable reference work. Like, he's got all the scholarship cited. He's got the arguments summarized. It is the go-to for that subject. There's nothing to rival it. Is what I would say.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think that you probably have the best sense of what's, problematic as far as all of Ehrman's works go. But so I would just echo what you said on it. So I don't really have any other recommendations. But like, I know that there are certain portions of his pop level book that when he supports it with like evidence, that I feel more secure
That's
about.
a good point. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's true. Right. Yeah. I also, because I'm actually an expert in historical methodology, that was actually another one of my majors. My PhD majors was historical methodology. But when he describes historical methodology, I cringe a lot. It's not great. So that stuff's not good. He knows what he's doing, but he doesn't know how to explain why what he's doing is good, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
When he's doing the peer-reviewed stuff, he's sort of in automatic mode. He's doing what he was taught, and he's good at it. But I don't think he's good at explaining why it works, like why he's right. And I don't think that's unique to him. I think that's a lot of historians are in that unfortunate position, and that was what David Fisher also pointed out in Historians' Fallacies, that this is a problem field wide, that historians are bad at explaining why their methods are logically valid and why they work and things like that. And that is a problem, but it's not unique to Ehrman. It's not his particular problem.
Yeah. Well, that's going to be it for our stream tonight. Thank you so much, Rick, for taking 3 hours out of your Friday to respond to Kipp Davis again.
Yeah, it was worth it. It was gave me the opportunity to make some points that needed to be made, and I hope the audience benefited, like understood what I was saying, and right. So anyway, I hope it was useful.
Well, I feel like if there was any kind of confusion or incoherence, it definitely wasn't on your part. It was my ability to try to string together like things that I thought would have been coherent, like lines.
Well, I think you did a good. Yeah, no, it was a good selection of things. I didn't see the whole like 2.5 hours of what they did, so I don't know what else was in there. But no, those were good selections and a good explanation of them. So yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Good. But in any case, if you want to find Richard Carrier, I do have his links down in the description. The original live streams down there too. If you want to double check to see what I left out of the stream, because I did leave a whole lot of stuff out. And so if you want to go and check that out, please do. And Rick, again, thank you for joining me. And I guess I will see everybody later.
All righty. Good night, everybody.
Yeah. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.